Chapter 1095. After dinner, the snow in Jianghu became heavier. The entire community was covered with snow. Li Xiaoxi had fallen asleep in Li Mudong's arms. He Yishui picked up a small piece of cake and put it into his mouth. He looked at Li Mudong, who was chatting with his mother, and smiled. "Don't leave tonight. It's so late and it's snowing heavily. I think it's frozen outside." "Okay." Mrs. He nodded with a smile. "Tong Tong, stay here. We can talk tonight. It's convenient for you to go to work with Yishui tomorrow. Let Xiaoxi play with me for a day. I can't get enough of this little girl. If I go to work with her, I'll be at least half a day late." Li Mudong looked at Yishui with a smile. She didn't object. In the past 2 years, she had been really familiar with Yishui. She had lived here for half a year before and after childbirth. "It's my own business. What are you afraid of? Who dares to deduct my salary? Just tell me and I'll help you." Mrs. He smiled and asked the nanny to clean up the room. She specially asked the nanny to put a new quilt on the crib. Wang Yuetong got up and followed her. She carefully put her sleeping daughter on the new crib and let the nanny take care of her. Then she returned to the living room. After the door was closed, the nanny bent down and pinched Li Xiaoxi's little face lovingly. Then she turned around and found a new bag of milk powder and a bottle. Li Mudong often lived in He Yishui's house. The guest room next to He Yishui's bedroom had basically become Li Mudong's room. Therefore, there were many things in the room. After preparing the things that could comfort Li Xiaoxi when she woke up, the nanny sat on a chair and turned on the TV in the room. She adjusted the volume to the lowest channel and continued to watch the TV series she was watching. The light from the TV was hazy. In silence, the little princess who was sleeping soundly frowned. At the center of her eyebrows, a 7-colored speck of light suddenly lit up. It was a speck of light that was smaller than a grain of rice. Normally, it would not be noticed at all. However, as the speck of light shone, a rainbow luster began to fluctuate between Li Xiaoxi's brows. A weak but incomparably sharp light enveloped Li Xiaoxi's petite body almost instantly. At the same time, a ray of pure white light began to distort and change in front of the crib, finally turning into an illusory figure shrouded in gentle light. The television in the room was still on. The nanny looked at the screen with relish, unaware of what was happening around her. Feng Qingwu lowered her head quietly and looked at Li Xiaoxi, who was sleeping soundly with her arms spread open. Then, she looked at the blurry layer of light that enveloped her body and was stunned. The 7-colored radiance that was growing sharper and sharper silently calmed down. The light seemed to hesitate for a moment before it slowly retreated back into Li Xiaoxi's forehead. Li Xiaoxi stared deeply at the weak spot of light between the baby's eyebrows, a little dazed. In the ancient bronze hall in the space-time corridor, when His Majesty said that doomsday was coming, she felt that her escape route was here. She knew of Li Xiaoxi's existence. She knew it the moment Li Xiaoxi was born. She used to be the youngest daughter of the first His Majesty. And now, Li Xiaoxi was the eldest daughter of Li Tianlan. Somehow, there was already some kind of connection between them. But now, when she saw the spot of light between Li Xiaoxi's eyebrows, she finally understood how perfect her escape route was. Tens of thousands of years ago, or even longer, this spot of light had appeared on her forehead. It only disappeared when she reached the peak. To a certain extent, Feng Qingwu's achievements today had a lot to do with this spot of light. This was the mark of King Wei. He had reincarnated several times, and it had been a long time since then. It was hard to tell where King Wei had come from. When countless lost memories could no longer be found, perhaps even His Majesty in the corridor of time and space would not remember how King Wei had appeared. But there was no doubt that in the beginning, King Wei was one of the most important cornerstones of the entire neutral camp. What was a cornerstone? The so-called cornerstone was the power that could support all the paths of the entire camp. King Wei was the head of the 4 divine artifacts in the space-time corridor. It was more important than the picture of all worlds, the Tower of Human Emperor, and the Xianyuan sword. No one could remember what King Wei was called in the beginning. According to vague records, the title of King Wei was bestowed by the first His Majesty, who was also Feng Qingwu's father, and it was unanimously recognized by all the major races of the neutral camp. In other words, King Wei was the King Wei of the neutral camp, and its title was recognized by all the forces of the neutral camp. In the space-time corridor, the title represented more than just power and status. Behind each title was the accumulation of the fate of the human race and the countless races of the neutral camp. This was one of the most important powers of the human race. In the blasphemy war that lasted for nearly 1,000 years, His Majesty in the space-time corridor used the Xianyuan sword as his weapon, transforming the endless fate of the human race into a sharp blade that covered the sky and killed the demons of the Order camp with one strike. To a certain extent, this was a display of his power to the extreme. King Wei was the cornerstone of the camp, and with the addition of the title, its mark naturally had an extraordinary significance. The light up between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows was the mark of King Wei, and it was also the mark that had appeared on Feng Qingwu's eyebrows. This mark had a name that everyone in the space-time corridor envied. It was called the neutral halo. The neutral halo was connected to the host's bloodline, and even had a deep connection to the host's soul. To the creatures of the other camp, this was a heavenly punishment that was difficult to escape, but to the creatures of the neutral camp, it was a gift from the gods that they dreamed of. This was something that was extremely rare in the entire space-time corridor. The effect of the so-called neutral halo was also clear and domineering. It greatly increased one's talent, physical quality, and luck. The so-called neutral halo, if translated into a term that everyone in Miracle City could understand, could also be called a halo. The protagonist halo. This was the real protagonist halo. The formation of similar halos required a cornerstone figure in the camp to separate a wisp of his soul with his own providence. But how many cornerstone characters were there in the entire space-time corridor? King Wei was not yet complete. To separate and form a neutral halo, he would have to pay a huge price. It was clear that he favored Li Chaoxi, and even spoiled him. What an enviable little guy. Feng Qingwu tapped Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and smiled. A strand of 7-colored radiance twined around Feng Qingwu's fingertip and fused into her flesh. Feng Qingwu's shadow became more and more illusory, almost completely transparent. Big sister will be staying here for a long time. From now on, it is me, and I will be you. When you reach my level, we can only separate. Little Tide, do you agree? Feng Qingwu froze. She looked at the baby's face and asked softly. Little Tide, who was sleeping soundly, moved her little mouth. She stuck her little finger into her mouth and sucked on it. Big sister, take it as a yes. Feng Qingwu smiled. She glanced at the dot of light between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and asked softly, what does King Wei think? The dot of light flickered silently. Feng Qingwu could vaguely feel a part of the energy from the dot of light fly out from between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows, pass through the villa, fly into the night sky, and float in the direction of Serenity Province. Feng Qingwu silently felt all this. After a while, she reached out her hand and touched Li Chaoxi's eyebrows. An illusory ray of light that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment blossomed between her fingers, slowly landing on the tiny dot of light. The dot of light began to shine, and the rainbow light slowly wrapped around the illusory light. Feng Qingwu pursed her lips and smiled, then said softly, I can't stay here yet. I'll reserve a place first. That way, even if I die in the final war, I can still return here and embark on the path of return. She bowed slightly to the dot of light and said softly, thank you, Uncle King Wei. The rainbow light flashed on Li Chaoxi's forehead, illuminating her small body. Feng Qingwu touched Li Chaoxi's little hand again and smiled, thank you too, little sister, or, little sister. Li Chaoxi turned over. Under the dim light, as he turned over, a shadow appeared on the wall. But it was not Li Chaoxi's shadow. Instead, it was a slender, hazy, and dreamy figure. That was Feng Qingwu's shadow. Feng Qingwu, who left her shadow on Li Chaoxi, looked through the snow outside the window and looked at the night sky. Her gaze seemed to have traversed an unimaginable distance in an instant, and she saw the battlefield once again. Just like what His Majesty had said. The human race no longer had a big picture. In the countless galaxies and galaxies that could be clearly seen, wars were erupting everywhere. Billions of interstellar fleets roared and roared. Battlefields covered the starry sky, the planets, the heavens, and the earth. It was not in a certain region. It was in the entire galaxy. The black ocean swept through hundreds of battlefields, bringing with it a monstrous sword light that charged forward on countless battlefields that were measured in units of light years. That dot of golden blood burned in the void, emitting a light that could shatter the starry sky, tearing apart battlefields one after another. Everything had come to an end. It was not only because of Li Tianlan's awakening. It was also because they had developed to the extreme. If they could not break through this bottleneck, what awaited them was an inevitable end. Feng Qingwu lowered her head, no longer looking at the battlefields that covered the starry sky. Because everything was meaningless. She would not make a move. Just like how the human emperor of the human emperor palace would not make a move. It was really meaningless. Silence was only a choice. Fighting was also a choice. The so-called hope of victory had long been smashed into despair in the illusory reality. Therefore, whether it was persisting in fighting or remaining silent, it had become a choice. This was the only power they had. It was also the power that everyone had always had. At least, they could choose how to die. Chapter 1096. The navigation system had failed, and the guide equipment had also failed half an hour ago. There was no mobile phone signal. For the rest of the journey, he could only rely on an ancient and primitive hand-drawn map to guide the way. There were dense trees and bushes that were enough to block the sun everywhere. Dozens of rare and highly poisonous creatures had been seen in just half a day, and this was the reason why he didn't deliberately look for them. The sense of direction could almost only be maintained by memory. Gu Xingyun stood in the extremely dense primeval forest and checked the hand-drawn map in his hand for a long time before he was sure that he should continue moving forward. The domain was mighty around him. Within a radius of more than 10 meters, any creature that bumped into the domain was completely crushed by it. Gu Xingyun walked forward, and his face became more and more cautious. This was an extremely ancient primeval forest in Nanyun, Jianghu State. It was not easy to distinguish the specific direction. Since entering this primeval forest 6 hours ago, Gu Xingyun had been rushing at full speed. Of course, his speed was not as fast as that of today's Li Tianlan, but he was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he was injured, he had advanced nearly 300 kilometers in this primeval forest in 6 hours. This was already deep in the primeval forest. It deviated from any route, had no tourist attractions, and was inaccessible. Primitive and ancient, it was not in any development plan of Jianghu State at all. If he hadn't come in person, Gu Xingyun wouldn't even know that this deep mountain forest was so big. The distance of hundreds of kilometers was obviously not all of this forest. According to the description on the hand-drawn map, it was at least 60 kilometers to reach the destination. The map was given by Jianghu. Since the news of Chen Fangqing's death spread throughout Jianghu State 4 days ago, Jianghu finally completely convinced Li Guangtu, and the three parties cooperated. In 3 days, Gu Xingyun had made some arrangements for the plan of the Special Warfare Group. In theory, this cooperation could be achieved, but Gu Xingyun asked Jiang Shangyu to fulfill his promise first. So Gu Xingyun secretly came to Nanyun after attending the farewell ceremony of Chen Fangqing's body yesterday. After confirming that his whereabouts had not attracted anyone's attention, he quietly entered this primeval forest. The destination was said to be a village. That was the place where he and Jiang Shangyu had agreed. Gu Xingyun was a little excited. He knew very well what it meant for him to be here, and he was looking forward to what would happen next. Because if Jiang Shangyu didn't lie, today or tomorrow, when he left this primeval forest again, the injury that he had recuperated for a few years would be completely healed, and his broken martial arts path would be extended in front of him again. In a short time, he might not be able to surpass the peak of the invincible realm and stand at the level of Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu. But according to Jiang Shangyu, if everything went well, when he left here, he would at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm. Gu Xingyun had been close to the peak of the invincible realm many years ago. However, his talent was not really top-notch, and the martial arts inheritance of Kunlun City did not record the scenery of the peak of the invincible realm, so he had been stuck in this bottleneck for many years. It was not until he was attacked by Li Tianlan on the eve of the maneuver of the two academies a few years ago that he saw the outline of the peak of the invincible realm in the almost perfect martial arts sword intent. So in the past 2 years, Kunlun City had been restraining and forbearance. At that time, Gu Xingyun didn't care about the temporary silence of Kunlun City and the temporary shrinkage of the Special Warfare Group, because everything was temporary. From that time on, he had made up his mind that as long as his injury got better and he entered the peak of the invincible realm, he would kill Li Tianlan at all costs. It didn't matter even if he had to completely become enemies with the giant group and face the endless revenge of the Dongqing clan and the Samsara Palace. He wanted to kill Li Tianlan as soon as he entered the peak of the invincible realm at all costs. No one could stop him. But the fact slapped Gu Xingyun hard in the face. There was no need for the giant group to stop him at all. After the maneuver of the two academies, Li Tianlan grew at an incredible speed. He didn't really enter the invincible realm, but he already had the power that almost surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. When everyone was talking about Li Tianlan being the top expert in the dark world, Gu Xingyun panicked, but his biggest feeling was helplessness. He tried his best to stop Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace, but it had little effect. Time seemed to be completely on Li Tianlan's side. Until Li Tianlan went to Kunlun City. Gu Xingyun lost. It was a fiasco. Because of Li Tianlan, he saw the scenery after the peak of the invincible realm. At the same time, because of fighting with Li Tianlan, he overdrew his potential and cut off his path. There was a storm inside the Special Warfare Group. Almost every day, someone was investigated. In a short period of time, the Special Warfare Group had shrunk by nearly a third. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were like the sun at high noon. The Xianxia group and Emperor Dong's palace merged perfectly without any awkwardness. The new group rose. Things were hitting Gu Xingyun's nerves one by one. That was the most desperate time for Gu Xingyun. That was the real despair. He knew very well what it meant. Perhaps Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were temporarily attracted by Chen Fangqing, but Gu Xingyun could be sure that once Chen Fangqing couldn't stop Li Tianlan and fell down, he and the Special Warfare Group would fall after Chen Fangqing. At the most pessimistic time, he really planned to leave Zhongzhou State. Of course, he didn't go to Annan State. If he wanted to leave Zhongzhou State, there were many places to go. Star State, the European continent, and even some superpowers second only to Zhongzhou State in the world, such as Snow Country, extended an olive branch to him. Now there were few masters in the dark world. As the god of war of Zhongzhou State, even if his majesty was gone, he could go to any country and get the position of the god of war of that country and rebuild the order of the special warfare system. And those countries also came up with a relatively perfect plan. Compared with the seemingly generous promise of Annan State, Star State, England, France, Germany, and Snow Country all put forward almost perfect plans. They invited Gu Xingyun to go to their country. He didn't need to take anything from Zhongzhou State. He just needed to take the Gu family's team there. As long as they could land safely, they would negotiate with Zhongzhou State. This could be said to be a negotiation, and the conditions were so generous that Zhongzhou State could offer them casually. How important was a god of war who controlled the special warfare system? The special warfare system. It was no exaggeration to say that it was the order of a country in the dark. It can look loose, it can even look chaotic, but whatever, no matter what, it must be under control. The aftermath caused by the chaos in Snow Country had not completely subsided. Instead, it had become more and more intense. Most of the invincible realm experts on the divine and holy lists had fallen, and all the superpowers were leaderless. With no one in control of the situation, the order of the dark world had completely collapsed. In some places, gangs, drug dealers, and killers began to emerge one after another. The crime rate skyrocketed, and all kinds of fights for interests took place every day. The chaos was not only spreading in the dark, but also on the surface. As time went by, no one knew how the situation would develop. Why could the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the current Emperor Dong's palace enter East Island? The royal family might not really welcome them to take root in East Island. But relatively speaking, they couldn't lose the order in the dark. So even if the person who controlled the order was not their favorite, or even hated, they would accept it if they had no other choice. After the chaos in Snow Country, Gu Xingyun could be said to be one of the top experts in the dark world. Everyone knew his current situation, so all the invitations to him were full of sincerity. According to Gu Xingyun's speculation, if he joined those powerful countries, this matter might really turn around. As long as those people met the conditions of Zhongzhou state, he and the Gu family had the possibility to continue to exist. But this was only for Zhongzhou state. Gu Xingyun was not afraid of Zhongzhou state. It was Li Tianlan. It had always been Li Tianlan. Run? That was not realistic at all. If he stayed in Zhongzhou state, Li Tianlan might restrain himself. But once he left Zhongzhou state, even if he was temporarily safe, when Li Tianlan entered the invincible realm, where could he go? Even if he could run, how could the Gu family run? This was the most important reason why he had never made up his mind. If Jiang Shangyu hadn't taken the initiative to find him, he had even begun to consider the possibility of surrendering to Li Tianlan. Giving up the position of the war god of the state. Even giving up the leadership of the special warfare group. When there was really no turning back, groveling and begging Li Tianlan for mercy seemed to be the only feasible. This was also an important reason why he could accept Jiang Shangyu's proposal without difficulty. What Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu wanted was only 2/3 of the leadership of the special warfare group. After all, he could still keep 1/3 of his assets. As a condition of exchange, he didn't have to grovel and look at Li Tianlan's face. Jiang Shangyu could even make him really enter the peak of the invincible realm. It could even make him break through the peak of the invincible realm within a year or two, half a step into that supreme realm. What else did Gu Xingyun hesitate about? He directly agreed to cooperate. There were only some slight doubts in his heart. Jiang Shangyu had the example of going straight from the thunder-shocking realm to the half-step invincible realm overnight, and now he had the strength beyond the peak of the invincible realm. The iron-like fact made Gu Xingyun not have many doubts in his heart. The village deep in the forest was one of Jiang Shangyu's secret bases, and it also hid his biggest secret. And there was also the power that gave Gu Xingyun a new life. Gu Xingyun's heart was beating violently. He kept speeding up in the gradually quiet forest, identified the direction, and rushed directly to the destination. Chapter 1097. The forest was dense and deep. Gu Xingyun's speed changed from slow to fast, and finally from fast to slow. In the extremely dense primeval forest, he finally stopped where he was and looked around with a dignified look. Everything around him seemed to have changed. The world was quiet. The grass and trees were quiet. Gu Xingyun stood under a thick giant tree, frowning and looking around. He didn't speak for a long time. He didn't know why he always felt that there was something wrong around him, but he didn't know what was wrong. A master's will was as firm as iron. The more powerful he was, the more he believed in his intuition. In the spiritual field, this was the subconscious. The uneasy intuition came from the subconscious. In his subjective consciousness, he couldn't find anything wrong, but it didn't mean that everything here was normal. It could only mean that he hadn't found anything abnormal yet. What on earth is wrong? Gu Xingyun focused his attention and looked around silently. The trees stood there quietly. There was no wind in the forest, not even any sound. The extreme silence with absolute weirdness made people feel more and more uneasy. It was as if everything around him had no life. The whole world seemed to be completely dead. Gu Xingyun's muscles gradually tightened. He didn't doubt the sincerity of Jiang Shangyu's cooperation with him. At least until now, he had never suspected that Jiang Shangyu wanted to hurt him. But the forest around him, which looked normal but extremely weird, made him feel more and more cold. Gu Xingyun didn't know why, but the fear deep in his heart began to spread little by little, making his whole body a little stiff. He took out the hand-drawn map again to confirm the location. It was less than 10 kilometers away from the destination. The direction was accurate. This also meant that he didn't go the wrong way. Then, what did this inexplicable feeling in front of him mean? Gu Xingyun stood there and hesitated for about half an hour. Then he slowly moved forward, step by step, and continued to move toward the destination. The forest seemed to be changing at any time, but it also seemed to be unchanged. The increasingly quiet atmosphere made Gu Xingyun feel that his breathing and heartbeat were extremely harsh. The sky seemed to be getting darker and darker. A drop of cold sweat dripped down Gu Xingyun's forehead and fell to the ground. Gu Xingyun walked carefully and subconsciously held his breath. The moment he held his breath, the ear-piercing sound seemed to have disappeared by a large margin. The incessant beating of his heart that was becoming more and more rapid seemed to have instantly turned into a deafening roar of thunder. Gu Xingyun's body froze in place. An unparalleled fear completely engulfed his will in an instant. He finally understood what was wrong. Silence. As they entered the forest, the environment became quieter and quieter. Several kilometers away, in the depths of the primeval forest, Gu Xingyun did not see any birds or beasts, not even a bug. This place was like a real land of death. Apart from himself, there were no other signs of life. The entire forest was extremely quiet. There were no living creatures, no wind, and even the branches and leaves of the surrounding trees did not move at all. It was as if everything had frozen here. It looked like a dense forest, but in fact, it was a tomb full of corpses. Gu Xingyun stared at the trees in front of him quietly. All the trees around him were extremely thick, but the trunks and leaves were faintly black. The straight trees twisted into exaggerated shapes without any rules. Such an obvious change began with a little distortion. Perhaps the trees were in this state of distortion from the moment he entered the forest, but the distortion was very small. After he entered the forest, it began to enlarge little by little, so that now, if he did not pay close attention, Gu Xingyun would even think that this extremely exaggerated and strange distortion was normal. And, the sunlight disappeared. Gu Xingyun could be sure that it was daytime. The forest might be dense, but there should be some subtle light here. But those lights had all disappeared at this time. It was dark all around. The forest of Nanyan seemed to have fallen into a cold winter, and the extremely cold temperature continued to spread in the increasingly thick darkness. Gu Xingyun concentrated on observing all the details around him. A hand fell on his shoulder without any warning. It penetrated his domain and even pinched his shoulder in a very friendly manner. Gu Xingyun, who was completely focused, jumped up almost in an instant. At the same time, his domain was extremely distorted, and the hand was directly thrown away from his shoulder. From the corner of his eyes, Gu Xingyun saw that it was a complete arm. The arm rotated in the air, and the slightly black blood kept dripping from the air. Where did the hand come from? This was a forest. Where did the hand come from? The problem was that there was no one here. Where did the hand come from? Gu Xingyun, who clearly felt that his shoulder was pinched, felt his heart beat wildly. Without any hesitation, he rushed directly to the place where the arm fell. The arm fell in a mass of vigorous grass. Gu Xingyun's figure followed closely. He stared at the grass carefully, as if he wanted to study the arm that did not look like a living person's. However, there was nothing in the bushes. There was no arm, no blood, only a dead branch that seemed to have been broken for a long time. Gu Xingyun looked at the grass in front of him and was silent for a long time. Was it his vision? Or, the arm had been taken away? Who was here? Gu Xingyun suddenly glanced around in a 360-degree manner. In his sight, in the dark forest, there were only extremely twisted trees that looked extremely painful and fallen. Those trees were quietly twisted, like pairs of eyes, with ferocious malice, staring at his every move. Gu Xingyun swallowed, and he began to step back. The feeling of uneasiness seemed to have broken through the limit of his heart. The destination for his breakthrough was not far away, but Gu Xingyun did not dare to go forward anyway. It was too strange here. Jiang Shanyu seemed to be too strange. He was ready to withdraw from the forest and go to the outside world to talk with Jiang Shanyu in detail. His retreat began to speed up, faster and faster. The dark, quiet, and twisted forest kept retreating. Gu Xingyun's domain was fully open, and he flew in the dark forest. But there was no light in front of him. Everything seemed to be getting darker and darker. Gu Xingyun ran wildly for nearly half an hour before he stopped. He was sure that he could see the sun half an hour ago. But now he was retreating, returning to the original place. But in the past half an hour, there was no sun in front of him, and the surroundings became darker and colder. The extreme silence made all his sounds become manic. His breathing was like a hurricane, and his heartbeat was like thunder. In such a quiet environment, Gu Xingyun could even hear the sound of his blood flowing in his body. It was the sound of the raging tide beating on the cliff like a tsunami. His face was pale, and he took out the map with a slight tremble. The flame bloomed in his hand. In the subtle light, he looked at the map in his hand quietly. Perhaps it was a psychological effect, but no matter how he looked at it, he felt that this seemingly ancient hand-drawn map was also revealing a kind of strange feeling. The flame flickered in the darkness. He carefully identified everything around him, and the more he looked, the colder his heart became. He retreated for nearly half an hour. But judging from the extremely complicated marks on the map, instead of being far away from the forest, he was moving deeper. So far, he seemed to be less than a kilometer away from the real destination. His palm was sticky, and it seemed that he was sweating a lot because of nervousness. Gu Xingyun held the map in one hand and wiped his chest with the other. A touch of incomparably mournful red appeared on the clothes on his chest, forming an extremely gloomy bloody handprint. Blood? His other hand that was holding the map was also becoming sticky. Gu Xingyun's heart almost stopped beating. Slowly, in the darkness, he lowered his head little by little and looked at the map in his hand. It was getting darker and darker. It was getting quieter and quieter. In the extremely low visibility, he could only vaguely see that he seemed to be carrying something in his hand. It was like a map, but it seemed to be much bigger than a map. The strong smell of blood spread in the darkness. He could clearly feel that the thick liquid was constantly flowing from the palm of his hand holding the map. Gu Xingyun's arm trembled slightly. Shaking, he flicked out another flame. The flame illuminated the darkness. At that moment, Gu Xingyun saw the map in his hand. His heart suddenly stopped for a moment, and then he threw out the map in his hand like crazy. In his hand, the map, which had become much larger, was a complete human skin. Warm blood flowed down from under the human skin. The human skin was soft, but the face was stubbornly raised, smiling at Gu Xingyun in an extremely strange way. Fuck. 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 Gu Xingyun covered his chest with one hand, and his eyes were wide open. The human skin that was thrown out fell on the tree. The trunk was instantly dyed red with blood. The thin layer of human skin smiled silently and strangely, moving quickly on the trunk. In just a second, Gu Xingyun felt dizzy, and the human skin had appeared upside down in front of him. Its body was hanging on the trunk closest to Gu Xingyun. Its head and feet were up, and the ferocious face full of blood was smiling at Gu Xingyun, while its empty eyes were staring at Gu Xingyun's eyes. His emotions seemed to have completely collapsed at this moment. Gu Xingyun was an expert of the invincible realm, and the war god of the nation. He had seen many opponents. But he had never seen this one. His emotions completely collapsed, and he suddenly broke out with all his strength. The domain spread in all directions. Regardless of anything else, he chose a direction at random and rushed over. The violent domain swept through the woods. The forest was quiet and deathly still. The darkness retreated frantically. Gu Xingyun moved forward at full speed. 1 minute? Half a minute? Or maybe it was just a few seconds. A familiar ray of sunshine suddenly appeared in front of him. Gu Xingyun, who was almost in tears, rushed directly to the sunshine in front of him without any hesitation. The next second, all the darkness suddenly faded. The forest also appeared behind him. He rushed out of a dark forest and fell down gracelessly. He landed on a relatively flat patch of grass. The sun shone down, but there was no temperature. It was pale and almost false. But it was light after all. Gu Xingyun completely relaxed, and he stared at the forest behind him. A dark forest was still staring at him quietly. The human skin did not rush out, either. Gu Xingyun breathed a sigh of relief. He took out a cigarette with trembling hands and lit it. He took a big puff and calmed his inner fear. He didn't even have time to think about what was going on. The light around him made him feel safe instinctively. He just wanted to get out of here now. He didn't even realize how abnormal the cold wind was around him in the warm winter of Nanyun. The cigarette was soon finished. Gu Xingyun stood up and calmed himself down. He had a fear of this forest from the bottom of his heart, so he kept his back to the back, stared at the direction of the forest, and slowly retreated. The grassland under his feet became flatter and flatter, and even the mottled old ground appeared. Gu Xingyun kept retreating until the back of his head touched something. Gu Xingyun's scalp went numb, and he suddenly turned around. In his sight, a lantern that he had hit was swaying and floating. What appeared in front of Gu Xingyun was a very old wooden door. The lantern was not hung directly above the door, but in the middle. On the pale lantern, a big word, "Shi," was written in red ink like blood. The white lantern and the red words made people feel uncomfortable no matter how they looked at it. Gu Xingyun carefully retreated for a distance, and then looked around. All he could see were white lanterns everywhere. The red word, "Shi," was everywhere. Old houses were neatly arranged on the street. Gu Xingyun seemed to be standing in the middle of the street. Gu Xingyun's heart began to sink, and it kept sinking. His face became pale, and there was no color at all. The cold wind between heaven and earth seemed to be more mournful. The sun seemed to be gradually dimming. Gu Xingyun looked at the surrounding environment in silence. Here was a village. To be exact. This was the hand-drawn map. No, it was marked on the human skin, destination. Chapter 1098. For the first time in his life, Gu Xingyun felt a bone-piercing chill. For the first time, he found that the wind and sunlight could be so cold, and that the light could be so pale. A slight wind blew in the village, and the sun shone down from the sky. The wind, rain, and sunlight were warm at first, but the longer they stayed here, the colder they became. It was indescribable gloom and coldness. Little by little, it pierced through the skin, froze the blood, and froze the soul. He felt that his body was dying little by little, and his vitality began to decay, become pale, and become dead. He became perfectly integrated with the village in front of him. Who is Jianghu? In a trance, Gu Xingyun suddenly began to think about this question, and quickly came up with a vague answer. The vague answer could not be said to be Gu Xingyun's mistake, but it could also be said to be his biggest mistake. He did pay attention to Jianghu. Whether it was the special status of the Jiang family or Jianghu himself, they were worthy of Gu Xingyun's attention. He wanted to draw the Jiang family into the special warfare group, and draw Jianghu into the special warfare group. Jianghu was undoubtedly a very outstanding young man, and he could even be said to be a very outstanding one. Gu Xingyun attached great importance to him. In order to completely tie Jianghu to Kunlun City, he even thought about marrying his daughter Li Qingqing to him. But it was also undeniable that he did not absolutely attach importance to Jianghu. He was easy to talk to, easy to get along with, ambitious to a certain extent, controllable, non-threatening, low-key, and calm. In the eyes of everyone, including Gu Xingyun, Jianghu was roughly such an image. It was not until now that Gu Xingyun suddenly realized that Jianghu, who was hiding behind that image, did not reveal not only his strength, but this village might be his biggest secret. His brain was a little chaotic, but the fear in his heart was gradually dissipating. With his willpower, he naturally could not be frightened to collapse. What he experienced today might be a little weird, but Gu Xingyun could be sure that in the current situation of himself, Jiang Shangyu, and Li Guangtu, this cooperation was beneficial to both sides. At least for the time being, Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu still needed to use their status to place their forces in various positions in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou state, and they had no reason to harm him. Gu Xingyun calmed down a little and looked at the small village in front of him. The village seemed to be quite old. The houses looked very old, and the internal layout seemed to be filled with the limitations of the times. The streets were very narrow, so it looked especially gloomy. White lanterns were hung on the doors of every house in the village, fluttering in the wind. The blood-red happiness character swayed slightly, and the whole village was filled with a very strange jubilation. Gu Xingyun seemed to be standing in the middle of the street, where he could see the outline of the village to the greatest extent. The street was very narrow, but extremely clean. It was obvious that someone had just cleaned it not long ago. However, standing in the village, Gu Xingyun did not feel any signs of activity. A deathly silence spread throughout the village. Under the sunlight, there were no signs of activity in the village. It looked like a mountain village that had been abandoned for a long time. Gu Xingyun felt that something was wrong, but he still couldn't tell what was wrong. He walked quietly on the street and soon walked through the whole village. The village was not big, with only about 200 households. But there was no one in the entire village. All the doors of the households were closed. In the absolute silence, even the sound of the wind seemed to have disappeared. Gu Xingyun slowed down his breathing and returned to the position where he had stood at the beginning. In front of him was a relatively large house. The pale lantern swayed in the wind, the dark wooden door, and the quiet atmosphere. The scene in front of him seemed to be indescribably cold. Gu Xingyun hesitated, and finally took 2 steps forward. He pulled the black metal ring on the wooden door and slapped it on the door. He slapped it. The sound of slapping was extremely harsh in the quiet environment, and it went far away from the deep street. Gu Xingyun's face became a little pale again. As an expert of the invincible realm, the willpower would not frighten him to the point of collapse, but everything he had experienced today was challenging his psychological endurance. His domain had shrunk to the extreme, and his body was completely tense, as if he was worried that something would suddenly rush out from behind the door. Gu Xingyun was now in a state of battle. There was no sound at the door, and no one came to open the door. Gu Xingyun hesitated and increased the sound of slapping again. The sound of slapping the door went farther on the street, and it sounded a little noisy. But the door was still silent. Even the nearby residents didn't make any sound. Gu Xingyun gritted his teeth and put his palm on the door. After hesitating for a few seconds, his palm slightly exerted force. Bang! The wooden latch that locked the door was broken by the force. The black door opened a gap to the inside. A cold airflow came to his face. Gu Xingyun's body shook subconsciously. He looked around, and there was no change around, but the cold doorway inside the door was dark. Gu Xingyun always felt that there was a pair of blood-red eyes at the door, staring at him. Phew, phew, Gu Xingyun took a few deep breaths, gritted his teeth, and pushed the door open a little again. The creaking sound was so clear that it was almost torturous. The pair of eyes at the door didn't appear, and there was only some dry firewood in the doorway. Gu Xingyun gritted his teeth and walked in. He had completely concentrated his attention, ready to face any unexpected situation at any time. But nothing happened. After walking out of the doorway, there was a simple courtyard. The wall facing the doorway was painted with an extremely oppressive black giant tree. A black cat was quietly lying on the wall, and a pair of eyes with contracted pupils were staring at Gu Xingyun silently. Gu Xingyun stopped. The black cat stared at him silently. A man and a cat confronted each other for about half a minute. Gu Xingyun, whose body was tense, slowly took a step forward. The black cat didn't move. He moved forward again. The black cat still didn't move. Until Gu Xingyun walked to the black cat kept lying on the ground, looking at the front silently. Gu Xingyun squatted down carefully, tentatively stretched out his hand, and put it on the black cat's body. The black cat was very hard, but its fur was extremely soft. It seemed to be a sculpture so realistic that even Gu Xingyun couldn't tell whether it was real or fake when he observed it closely. A sculpture with the skin of a real cat. Skin. Gu Xingyun suddenly thought of the human skin that looked like a map. He felt disgusted, stood up quickly, and walked to the front hall. He knocked on the door of the front hall as well. There was no response. Gu Xingyun hesitated, carefully pushed the door open, and walked in. The dark room avoided the sunlight to the greatest extent. The room was a little damp, with a touch of moldy smell that seemed to have been left for a long time. Is anyone at home? Gu Xingyun stood in the front hall and shouted with a voice loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear. His voice seemed to be magnified countless times in an instant, and the huge sound waves made his heart skip a beat. But in the next second, his huge sound waves seemed to be swallowed up in an instant, and the loud sound instantly became softer and then louder again. The transmission of the sound seemed to become completely chaotic, without any rules. The word ask was like thunder, but the voice of the latter few words was so low that even Gu Xingyun himself didn't hear it clearly. When it came to the last two words, the voice suddenly became louder. When Gu Xingyun's question appeared in his own ears, it became an inexplicable sentence. Is it home? Gu Xingyun clenched his fists and waited for a long time, but he didn't get any response. There was dead silence in the courtyard, without any vitality. Gu Xingyun walked slowly to the bedroom. His palm fell on the doorknob. Finally, he clenched his teeth and pushed the door open. The sound of the door hitting was dull and hoarse. Gu Xingyun stared at the bed in the bedroom. After entering the village, he finally saw people for the first time. Two figures were lying quietly on the bed, covered with quilts, and had no reaction to Gu Xingyun's sudden appearance. Gu Xingyun breathed heavily and walked into the bedroom regardless. He finally saw the scene on the bed clearly. There were not two people. There seemed to be a young couple on the bed. Their appearances were very ordinary. Between them, there was a little girl about 6 or 7 years old sleeping. The girl's palm clutched the quilt tightly, and the smile on the corner of her mouth was strangely sweet. The couple was lying on the bed, with their eyes closed. No breathing, no heartbeat. But their posture was too peaceful and leisurely. Gu Xingyun couldn't even be sure whether they were dead bodies or ordinary people who were sleeping soundly. Gu Xingyun walked to the window, slowly stretched out his hand, and carefully put it on the young man's forehead. During the whole process, he was staring at the young man. As long as the young man made any movement, he would react immediately. But the young man didn't move from beginning to end. He just lay there and slept quietly. His palm was on the young man's forehead. With a little warmth. There was body temperature. But there was no heartbeat or breathing. Gu Xingyun's own breathing seemed to start to become difficult. This time, he was finally sure that the family of 3 on the bed, they were all dead people. They were all corpses. And they were corpses that had just died. He thought of the strange silence in the village. Could it be that the whole village, every house, was filled with corpses that had just died? Or, Gu Xingyun was a little confused, and his palm subconsciously exerted force. Crack, there was a slight sound like plastic inside the head of the young man's corpse. For no reason, Gu Xingyun thought of the black cat at the door. Or, it was not 3 corpses in front of him, but 3 puppets that could be mistaken for real? Dummies? Gu Xingyun breathed a sigh of relief, but his spirit suddenly tightened in an instant. People, maybe they were fake. But their skins were all real. Gu Xingyun could be sure of this. Placed in front of him were pieces of incomparably complete human skin. No matter what was under the human skin, what was in front of him was human skin. It was genuine human skin. Gu Xingyun gritted his teeth and slowly loosened his palm. Meow. The moment his palm loosened, an extremely shrill cat's cry suddenly rang in Gu Xingyun's ears. A slight weight fell on Gu Xingyun's shoulder. Gu Xingyun, who was completely focused on the front, was shocked and subconsciously looked back. The black cat he saw at the door seemed to have come alive in an instant. It lay on his shoulder and stared into his eyes. Meow. His scalp was numb. A cold chill completely broke all the defenses in Gu Xingyan's heart. Hee, a clear laughter suddenly sounded in the bedroom. The quilt on the bed moved slightly. The little girl, who had been lying between the husband and wife without any breath or heartbeat, slowly sat up. She opened her dark eyes without any white, looked at Gu Xingyan quietly, and smiled sweetly. "Dad, where's my dog?" Chapter 1099. A clear and even sweet voice and a shrill cat's cry rang out at the same time. No words could describe the feeling at this moment. The numbness passed directly from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. His heartbeat accelerated wildly, and panic spread uncontrollably. Gu Xingyan realized how concentrated he was. The 3 dolls in the bedroom seemed to have unconsciously attracted all his attention and put his spirit in a state of extreme concentration. When this state was suddenly broken in an extremely frightening way, Gu Xingyan's reaction was no different from that of ordinary people. His blood pressure soared rapidly. It was completely subconscious instinct. Gu Xingyan shook his arms frantically, trying to get rid of the black cat that silently fell on his shoulder. The clear sound was silent for a moment. As Gu Xingyan shook his arms almost in a struggle, the cat's cry that made people panic suddenly rang out. Meow, meow, meow. It was shrill, miserable, and gloomy. The cat's cry kept ringing, and the black cat grabbed Gu Xingyan's clothes tightly. Its claws even penetrated the clothes and clasped Gu Xingyan's shoulders desperately. No matter how violently Gu Xingyan shook his arms, even if he broke out his own domain, the black cat stayed firmly on his shoulder, but the cat's cry became more and more shrill and miserable. Gu Xingyan's heart seemed to have completely collapsed. Even in the face of Li Tianlan, even though he knew that he was no match for him, he still dared to fight against that young guy. He no longer cared about the dignity of the war god of the state. He suddenly turned around, shook his arms, and strode out of the bedroom. The high-pitched and shrill cat's cry spread from the bedroom to the front hall, to the courtyard, and even throughout the village. Gu Xingyan rushed directly to the door. The uneasiness in his heart was almost tangible. The strange feeling brought to him by this dead village was even more serious than that in the forest. In contrast, he would rather go back to the forest to face that human skin than stay here for a minute or a second. The wooden door was knocked open by him. The moment he stepped out of the door, his shoulder was slightly lighter. The black cat that had been grabbing onto his shoulder leapt up lightly and jumped down from his shoulder. It lay at the door, staring at Gu Xingyan with its gradually blood-red eyes, but it did not go out. Gu Xingyan did not feel relieved at all. Standing outside the door, a chill that almost froze him completely seemed to have swallowed all of his consciousness. The village, the street was still the same street that he was not familiar with, but it was not unfamiliar either. It looked the same, but it had changed a lot. The same clean, narrow road, the same squat house, a pale white lantern swaying in the wind. What was different was the people. Human. Yes, people. The previously quiet and empty street was now filled with swaying silhouettes. Only then did Gu Xingyan realize that the sky on the horizon had completely darkened. The pale and somewhat chilly sunlight disappeared. Night fell. It seemed to be a clear dividing line. When the night shrouded the village, the whole village came to life. Creak, the sound of the door being pulled open rang out. The doors of the houses on the street were pulled open one by one, and people walked out of their homes with all kinds of expressions and emotions. After entering the village, Gu Xingyan heard a sound for the first time. "Aunt, I'll go to school tomorrow." A very young villager walked to the side of a middle-aged woman and said with a bright smile. The middle-aged woman nodded and sighed. "Old Lu's son, I don't know what kind of girl he's looking for. I want to eat fried paste noodles." The young man scratched his head. The woman glanced at him. "Ah, my husband is going to hunt in the mountains tomorrow. There seems to be a wild boar in the mountains." The young man scratched his head. I still don't want to marry him. I heard that he is ready to propose, but his family is not easy to get along with. The woman sighed. I'm going to the construction site tomorrow. I don't know if it's easy to buy a ticket. I can afford 5 million yuan. The young man smiled. But is it your first time? The voices around began to increase. The villagers gradually became energetic. Everyone saw that their close neighbors were greeting each other. Second sister-in-law, is your son in the city? I don't know what to eat. Alas. I'm going to be late tomorrow. I don't know if my salary will be deducted. I'm going to be late tomorrow. I don't know if my salary will be deducted. I heard that the old man of the Liu family died. This dress looks so festive and young. Gu Xingyun looked at this scene in a daze. In more than 50 years of life, he seemed to feel the madness and malice from the whole world for the first time. His spirit gradually became dull, and he just looked at these people in front of him silently. These people were indeed human beings. But everyone's spirit seemed to have become completely chaotic, and even produced a variety of different personalities. Their conversation was in full swing, and it looked very lively, but the words that came out of their mouths were completely incongruous. However, it was obvious that they didn't realize this at all, and continued to talk, as if they were programmed to talk until the end of time. No one noticed Gu Xingyun. It was as if his existence did not exist at all. Gu Xingyun's face was pale. Looking at the increasingly lively street in front of him, he was covered with cold sweat. He was really a little scared. He didn't want to stay here for a second in this crazy and chaotic village. Thus, he quietly walked into the crowd of villagers. Being in close contact with these villagers, his hands and feet were cold, and he carefully moved in the direction in his memory. He walked very slowly. But his destination was very clear. Obviously, he didn't lose his way. He wanted to go back to the forest, cross the forest, and return to Nanyun and Yuzhou. Even the ice and snow of Kunlun City at the foot of Mount Qinyun were much warmer than here. He didn't know where this place was. But he knew very well that only the place outside this damn place was the real human world. The street gradually came to an end. Thus, Gu Xingyun naturally entered an extremely narrow alley. Gu Xingyun couldn't help swallowing. He remembered very clearly that the small alley around him didn't exist at all not long ago. At the end of the street, he should see the forest. But now, the forest was gone. The moment Gu Xingyun turned around, the street disappeared. The place where he came in had become a wall. All the bustling and noisy sounds outside the street disappeared instantly. The whole village seemed to become dead silent again. The back road completely disappeared. Forward became the only way. There were no street lights in the village. It was dead silent and dark. Gu Xingyun's breathing became more and more rapid. He walked forward carefully. Maybe after a minute or 5 minutes, his eyes finally adapted to the darkness around him. The visibility in front of him was still extremely low. But vaguely, he seemed to see a person standing at the end of the alley. Maybe it was standing, or maybe it wasn't. It seemed to be a woman. Her long hair completely covered her face, and it was unscrupulously draped in front of her. In the night, her red dress seemed to be glowing with a blood-like mournful luster. Her body was bent forward, and her body was twisted into a strange angle. She stretched out her hands and was moving towards Gu Xingyun little by little. There was no way back. In the absolutely dark and quiet alley, Gu Xingyun was walking face to face with the thing at the end of the alley. He couldn't see the face behind the long hair, but he instinctively felt that the other party's eyes were staring at him coldly. Deep breath, relax. Deep breath, relax. Gu Xingyun kept adjusting his breathing, but his steps were getting slower and slower as if they were filled with lead. It seemed to be aware of his speed. The distorted red figure at the end of the alley suddenly began to accelerate. Its body became more and more distorted, and its long arms rushed directly to Gu Xingyun. Fuck! Gu Xingyun, whose heart was about to collapse, roared directly. The domain that was condensed to the extreme suddenly exploded around him. The turbulent power surged wildly, and his body rushed directly to the red shadow. Fight. He could only fight. This was the only choice. The domain was vast and mighty. Gu Xingyun appeared directly at the position of the red shadow. Eold was darkness and dead silence. The night was so dense that it seemed eternal. But the red shadow suddenly disappeared. Everything that had just happened seemed to be an illusion. It was as if that figure had never existed. Tick, tick, the ticking sound, which was close at hand, came from behind Gu Xingyun. The sound was light, but it was deafening. The strong smell of blood continued to spread. It was blood. To be exact, it was the sound of blood falling on the ground. Gu Xingyun thought of the red shadow that disappeared. The other party didn't disappear. Behind me. Gu Xingyun suddenly turned around. It was still dark. There was no twisted red shadow. However, the faintly discernible smell of blood in the surroundings continued to spread. Tick, tick, the sound of blood dripping sounded from behind Gu Xingyun again. Gu Xingyun turned around again at a faster speed. Tick, tick, the sound of blood dripping was still behind him. The smell of blood was getting stronger. Gu Xingyun stood where he was. He slowly lowered his head and looked at his feet. The sticky blood had covered the road under his feet, and it was extremely sticky. The sound of dripping became clearer, and drops of blood seemed to fall on Gu Xingyun's body. He was a little dizzy. He was in a trance. Gu Xingyun shook his head hard. He knew that the thing was closely behind him, and it was even about to stick to him. But every time he turned around, the other party seemed to appear behind him. He couldn't see it. As if he could never see it. Gu Xingyun tried to take a step forward. His whole body was soft, and he seemed to be extremely weak. 2 clear footsteps could be heard on the blood-soaked ground. The thing behind him moved almost at the same time as him. Gu Xingyun stopped again. The thing behind him also stopped. It seemed that something had stuck to his back. It was faintly discernible. Gu Xingyun didn't know if it was his illusion. His cell phone suddenly rang. It was supposed to be very soft music, but in the current atmosphere, it was indescribably harsh, with a strong ominous aura. Gu Xingyun trembled slightly and subconsciously took out the phone. The phone that had no signal for a long time had full signal bars at this time. Jianghu's name was shaking on the phone. Gu Xingyun gritted his teeth and answered the phone directly without any hesitation. Your Highness, I'm sorry. There was an accident. I'm late. Jianghu's gentle voice sounded on the other end of the phone. As he spoke, the blood on the ground began to disappear, and the alley began to disappear. All kinds of chaotic sounds rang in his ears again. Gu Xingyun held the phone, and his body trembled. He suddenly found that everything just now seemed to be extremely illusory. He did not move his body. His body was still standing by the gate, and the black cat behind him was still staring at him. He stood on the street, listening to the chaotic conversation around him. I can assure you that it was an accident. Jianghu's voice was apologetic and sincere, but it was extremely terrifying in Gu Xingyun's ears. The corner of his mouth moved with difficulty. He opened his mouth several times and finally made a sound. Where are you? The domain spread over silently. Jianghu's figure gradually took shape in the vague domain, and finally stood in front of Gu Xingyun. I'm sorry. Jianghu looked at his pale face and said again. Gu Xingyun looked at him in a daze. After a long time, he asked in a hoarse voice, where is this? This is my territory. Jianghu was silent for a while and laughed. It's my base. Of course, it will also be your Highness's base in the future. Your Highness, you kept your promise and came here, and I kept my promise to you. This will be one of our most important bases. From now on, we are on the same side. He said slowly, stretched out his palm to Gu Xingyun, and said in a low voice, Your Highness Gu Xingyun, welcome to the shadow world. Chapter 1100. After attending Chen Fangqing's funeral, Li Tianlan returned to the hotel. He had his own property in Yuzhou. Now many people were eyeing it, but no one dared to do anything about it. The prince's mansion, which could be exchanged for astronomical amounts of money as long as he opened his mouth, was his property. But it was the wedding house prepared for him and Dongqing Rushi by the Dongqing clan. If Dongqing Rushi was in good condition, Li Tianlan would not mind taking Qin Weibai to live in it. But in Dongqing Rushi's current state, Li Tianlan felt a little awkward to do so. Qin Weibai also had many properties in Yuzhou, two of which could be said to be in the center of Yuzhou, where the traffic was extremely convenient and everything was convenient. But for the same reason, Dongqing Wudi, the key members of the Bai family and other giant group gathered in Yuzhou. Li Tianlan also felt very awkward. This could not be regarded as being overcautious. This year, Li Tianlan was 24 years old. For the time being, he had not really experienced the loneliness of standing at the top and the power of the world, but he had subconsciously begun to consider the chain reaction caused by his every move. Especially in this sensitive period, Li Tianlan did not know how many times he had told himself that at this stage, he could not take a wrong step. So after thinking about it, he still lived in the hotel. To some extent, only this hotel could be regarded as his own property. The Flourishing Age Fund secretly held 27% of the shares of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which could be said to be the second largest shareholder in the hotel. As the Flourishing Age Fund merged into Emperor Dong's palace, the owner of these shares naturally became Li Tianlan. After dinner in his own hotel, Li Tianlan received a call from Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi's voice sounded very calm on the phone, but perhaps it was a psychological illusion. Li Tianlan always felt that his tone was a little depressed. "Tianlan, come and have a cup of tea at home," Dongqing Wudi said slowly. Li Tianlan looked at his watch. At 8:00 in the evening, after attending Chen Fangqing's funeral, Dongqing Wudi went to the army headquarters building. Until now, he probably had not eaten. Li Tianlan smiled and said softly, "Let's have dinner together." "I'll go there now. There are a few good dishes in the hotel. I'll take them there by the way." "Okay." Dongqing Wudi smiled. Although he was a little depressed in his heart, there was still a touch of joy in his voice. "Bring Little Bai here and stay at home tonight." Li Tianlan hesitated for a moment and agreed. In Yuzhou, the house that Dongqing Wudi mentioned was the manor of the Bai family. Li Tianlan silently thought about what had happened in the past few days. After thinking for about 2 or 3 minutes, he raised his head and said, "Let's go together." Qin Weibai had just put down the phone to order food. She nodded and asked, "Should we call the fatty?" "No need." Li Tianlan shook his head. He and Xing Tian have been busy these days. Don't worry about him. Xianyuan Wushang was very busy. On the day of Chen Fangqing's death, Li Huaqing held a meeting in the Chen family until 3 in the morning. During the nearly 14-hour meeting, Li Tianlan was under unimaginable pressure. At this stage, no matter how strong he was, he could not reach the point of dictating the entire world. Compromise, retreat, and when there was no other choice, no matter how unwilling he was, he had to make these decisions. At the meeting, it was decided that Hua Xingyang would temporarily preside over the work of the cabinet. At the same time, many departments of the cabinet were adjusted to a certain extent. In just a few days, it was said that there were some changes in Bai Qingqian's transfer. Unfavorable things happened one after another. Li Tianlan had almost no power to fight back and could only compromise for the time being. He had to be steady. He had to be steady. No matter what he did now, no matter what he did, his actions would be misunderstood or even misinterpreted into other meanings. The only thing he could do was to keep silent and keep making concessions in silence. Xianyuan Wushang also clearly felt Li Tianlan's pressure. He even took the initiative to transfer most of the pressure to himself. He almost made a guarantee that he would find out the cause of Chen Shi's death. With Chen Fangqing's death, Chen Shi, who died on the same day as him, was naturally thought by everyone to be killed by Li Tianlan. The same cause of death, the same mystery, and the same contact with Li Tianlan. All the clues were extremely unfavorable to Li Tianlan. Chen Fengqing's death had crossed the bottom line of Zhongzhou state. And Chen Shi's death, in the eyes of others, was almost like Li Tianlan slapping everyone in the parliament unscrupulously. This was also the main reason why he had been under great pressure these days. Xianyuan Wuxiang could not find out the cause of Chen Fengqing's death for the time being. But he could find out the truth of Chen Shi's death. Li Tianlan had been making concessions step by step. He had not left Yuzhou until now, waiting for the truth. So since he came back in the middle of the night, Xianyuan Wuxiang had locked himself in his room. It was said that he was fully cooperating with Xing Tian to investigate the cause of Chen Shi's death. Li Tianlan did not know how they could investigate the truth without going out. But perhaps Xianyuan Wuxiang's attitude was too firm, so Li Tianlan instinctively believed him. Walking out of the room, Li Tianlan took a deep look at the closed door on the opposite side. He was sure that Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian had not left the room these days. But in his perception, the opposite room was empty. Not only was there no breath of living people, even the furniture inside had disappeared. In Li Tianlan's perception, everything in the opposite room had become pure emptiness. He narrowed his eyes and shook his head, saying, "Let's go." Qin Weibai subconsciously took his arm and also glanced at the opposite side of Xianyuan Wuxiang. She silently followed Li Tianlan to the elevator. In the room that the two of them did not notice, there was already an extremely dark void around them. Countless stars were twinkling in the void. Subtle lights constantly lit up in the dark space, and then quickly fell silent. They were not the distant stars around them. Instead, they were tiny characters. The characters flickered and appeared, and then went away in an instant. They seemed to fly thousands of kilometers in a very short time, flying into the distance and turning into a faint glimmer, which looked like a starry sky. The words flew further and further away. The furthest one could no longer be seen, but the words that were constantly being created were still moving further away. Hence, there were more and more starlight. They disappeared and appeared in batches, and their positions were constantly changing. In the silent void, it was as if the stars in the sky were constantly arranged and twinkling. In the vast void, there was a huge writing brush flying. With the void as ink, the huge writing brush carved characters one after another in the vast space at an extremely fast speed. In the void stood a giant that could be said to be indomitable. His body, which was originally the size of a normal person and looked somewhat harmless, seemed to be magnified thousands of times here. He stood in the dark void, and at this time, his huge body revealed an indescribable majesty. The shimmer was everywhere. Xianyuan Wuxiang, who had transformed into a giant, held the same huge writing brush tightly and kept writing in the darkness. Rather than saying that he was writing, it was more accurate to say that the writing brush was controlling his palm to write. The original form of the writing brush was Xing Tian. When he opened his power to the greatest extent, he became a writing brush in this void that could almost reach the sky in terms of height. Starting from the smallest things, he began to deeply explore the truth of Chen Shi's death. In this huge deduction, the only thing Xianyuan Wuxiang needed to do was to provide his own vitality and countless recovery methods that belonged to Saint to help Xing Tian maintain his own state. At this time, the vitality of the two was completely connected. In the case of sharing life, Xianyuan Wuxiang's existence gave Xing Tian the greatest guarantee, and also made Xing Tian's deduction more and more leisurely. 20 years ago, Chen Song was Lu He's driver. The national emblem of Star State issued a new revised law. One night in England, the rich William died in a car accident. The financial crisis of East Island. Military counselor founded the Flourishing Age Fund. The Deludes Group declared bankruptcy. A mountain village in Zhongzhou state had 35 newborns in a year. Chen Lan's salary increased by more than 30%. Han Jia planned to send his son abroad to study. There was a terrorist attack in France. There were so many of them that they were densely packed. One after another, the writing brush kept writing in the crazy waving. Time was meaningless. No one knew how long the real time of 3 days passed in the void. But the brush kept on writing, and it didn't stop. 1 thing, 10 things, 100 things, 1,000,000 things, 10,000,000 things, hundreds of millions, billions, tens of billions. There were countless incidents that seemed to be completely unrelated to each other. But as more and more things were written with the brush, each thing began to gradually connect after going through millions of twists and turns. 2, 3, thousands, and more people who had nothing to do with each other in their lives began to interact with each other that even they themselves didn't know about. For example, if William, the rich businessman in England, hadn't died in a car accident, then Han Jia wouldn't have sent his son abroad to study. These two things seemed to have nothing to do with each other. But they also had a direct relationship. Everyone had their own network around them. People in their own network also had their own network. Everyone on the internet had their own small circle. All kinds of people. When everyone interacted with each other because of one thing, the circles on the internet began to fluctuate to different degrees. Such fluctuations might be subtle. But when tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of things were listed, the subtle fluctuations appeared in the most obvious way in front of Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian. From this point of view, why did Qianxi die? Maybe it was because of Li Tianlan, or maybe it was because of other reasons. This was the time limit. When this limit was no longer meaningful, the original reason could be defined by the writing brush, Xing Tian. Why did Qianxi die? Because 20 years ago, Chen Song was Lu He's driver. There was a reason. Now what Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian needed to do was to find that result. This was cause and effect. The writing brush kept shining. Somewhere in the quiet void, Xianyuan Wuxiang's voice clearly sounded with a long sigh. The writing brush in his hand was still moving. After countless twists and turns of events, the writing brush wrote Qianxi's name for the first time. Chapter 1101. The densely packed words flew further and further away, gradually turning into pieces of glittering starlight in the void. But when Qianxi's name appeared for the first time, the two words suddenly shone as if by magic. The fluttering brush seemed to have suddenly outlined two suns. The light was incomparably bright, and all the surrounding starlight seemed to have disappeared. Imperceptibly, among the countless events, a large number of karmic connections began to collapse. The brush continued to write, but unlike before, Qianxi's name was like a central point. In a flash, all the events began to be written with the Qin family and even Qianxi as the center. Those things that seemed inexplicably unrelated to the Qin family completely disappeared. One event after another began to appear around the Qin family. Every core member of the Qin family, every distant relative, every servant. Every friend, friend of a friend, friend of a servant, friend of a relative. Friends of friends of friends. In a flash, another incomparably complex web of events began to appear, woven by thousands of people. Slowly, the clear light flowed from Xianyuan Wuxiang's palm into the brush. The brush moved faster and faster, and the writing gradually became impudent and fierce. Qianxi's name appeared for the second time. The already extremely complex web of events was once again broken by more than half. A large number of Qin family members and friends were eliminated, and the dense web became a relatively complicated ball of threads, all kinds of clues intertwined together. The brush continued to write. Qianxi's name soon appeared for the third time. The light in the void was even brighter. The complicated ball of threads was simplified a lot. At the same time, many suspects were eliminated. Qianxi's name appeared for the fourth time. It was also at this time that the ball of threads intertwined with all kinds of clues began to become clear. Threads spread in all directions with Qianxi as the center, connecting one seemingly unimportant event after another. The web of events began to become clear and simple. Qianxi's name appeared for the fifth time. Most of the original hundreds of threads disappeared in an instant, leaving only 30 or so, connecting less than 20,000 events. The writing continued. But the brush gradually began to tremble. Xianyuan Wuxiang also trembled, but his face was taut, and he gritted his teeth and persevered. Xianxi's name appeared for the 6th time. The 30 lines turned into 9. Tens of thousands of incidents became less than 2,000 incidents. The slowly moving brush wrote Xianxi's name for the 7th time. The 9 lines became 3. The less than 2,000 incidents were reduced to less than 200. The 3 lines represented the 3 people closest to Xianxi. They were also the 3 most suspicious people. As for the events that were less than 200, it was what the 3 of them had done recently, who they had interacted with, and what the people who had interacted with the 3 of them had interacted with the people they knew. This kind of interaction would continue to develop with the 3 of them as the core, and what would be the final result if the series of events continued to link up. Xianxi's name didn't light up this time. However, the events on one of the 3 lines continued to develop, and at the end, a question mark appeared. Xing Tian, who was in a state of investigation, could be said to have no self-awareness. Xianyuan Wushang couldn't control the brush to write. All he could do was provide it with his own life force. Therefore, this question mark was written by the power of karma itself. A question mark popped up. What did this mean? Nowadays, there were not many people on earth that Xing Tian couldn't even write their names and things. There were probably no more than 10 people. Li Tianlan, Qin Weibai, and Xing Tian couldn't write them. Dongxing Rushi and Wang Yuetong couldn't write them. Wang Tianzong and Xing Tian couldn't write them. Li Huacheng and Xing Tian could barely write half of them. Jiang Shangyu and Xing Tian couldn't write them. This list didn't include Xianyuan Wushang and Lin Shi. Decades later, Zhou Yuanshan's name might be added to this list. But now, Xing Tian couldn't write them. It had nothing to do with Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. It had nothing to do with Dongqing Rushi and Wang Yuetong. Wang Tianzong didn't have that ability. If it was Li Huacheng, Xing Tian could write at least one word in his name, and then add a question mark. When all these targets were ruled out, who else could it be? Who else could it be? Jiang Shangyu. This was the answer that Feng Qinggu told Xing Tian, and it was also Xing Tian's own answer. He was not surprised by this answer, and it wasn't even important. The most important thing was that they found the line that connected Jiang Shangyu to him. 2 of the 3 lines disappeared the moment the question mark appeared. All that was left was a dazzling line that appeared in the void. More than half of the related matters were instantly reduced, leaving only a few. Within half a year of becoming Qianxi's full-time secretary, Mao Song met Lu Dongyue at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Lu Dongyue introduced his cousin Lin Yin to Mao Song. Lin Yin became Mao Song's lover. Lin Yin's code name in the Phoenix Pavilion was Red Snow, and he was Lu Dongyue's direct subordinate. Lu Dongyue believed that Qianxi's future was bright, and his full-time secretary was bound to become an important figure in the Prince Group. This was a long-term investment. 20 years ago, when Lu Dongyue's company was facing a major crisis, he received an important investment. The investor was Distance Investment Group. The Jiang family of Beijiang owned 75% of the shares of Distance Investment Group. 10 years ago, Lu Dongyue was secretly absorbed into Phoenix Pavilion and became the leader of Cyan Phoenix Group. He was responsible for the affairs of Nanyun for Kunlun City, providing an opportunity to infiltrate the Phoenix Pavilion. Mao Song was the 16th chess piece of Phoenix Pavilion in Southern Cloud. Lin Yin was Mao Song's lover. As the master. After the battle in North Sea. In order to cope, a rainbow-colored ray of light suddenly appeared. The brush continued to write. Cope secretly met with Mao Song and got Mao Song's promise. Blood Shirt and Mao Song shared life and appeared at the place where Chen Fangqing's body was stored. Mao Song and Chen Shi were in close contact. Chen Shi's name appeared on the brush again. Everything that had happened had come to light. The brush was still writing. It wrote dozens of things in succession, and then everything was completely over. The void disappeared abruptly. The huge brush and the giant version of Xianyuan Wushang all disappeared. Xing Tian's huge body almost collapsed on the ground. His face was pale, and his body was covered with sweat. Xianyuan Wuxiang, who looked harmless, was also extremely weak. All the furniture in the room was restored to its original state the moment the void disappeared. Xianyuan Wuxiang fell on the bed, panting for a long time, and then slowly sat up. Nothing can happen to Mao Song and Lin Yin. He looked at Xing Tian and said slowly. Xing Tian nodded, stretched out his huge hand, tore the space, and condensed a brush. He thought for a moment, and then slowly wrote in the void. In order to avoid suspicion as much as possible, Mao Song's life will not be in danger for the time being. At this stage, his death will cause a lot of changes in the plan, and the situation is very optimistic. In order to avoid complications, Mao Song will be very safe in the near future. His death will happen a year later, when everything calms down and he is forgotten. Kill him and copulate? Given his character, this is completely reasonable. Likewise, in order to stabilize Mao Song, Lin Yin's life will also be protected, and she will also be very safe in the near future. One day in a year, she will die with Mao Song, and there will be a lot of rumors. This is also reasonable. The words imprinted in the void flickered twice, and then disappeared in the void. Xing Tian glanced at Xianyuan Wuxiang and said hoarsely, 1 year should be enough. It won't take that long, but, so be it. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded. The brush in Xing Tian's hand became a mass of air again. This also belonged to the power of calligraphers. If investigating the truth of Chen Shi's death through tens of billions of events was to establish the power of cause and effect, then the 2 paragraphs about the ending of Mao Song and Lin Yin after Xing Tian's words were equivalent to prophecies. 1 year, this was the ending written by Xing Tian. During this period, unless there was a more powerful authority than Xing Tian that directly crushed everything he said, the fate of the 2 could hardly be changed. They would be very safe for a year, and even if they encountered danger, they would be safe. They would suddenly die one day a year later, together, and cause a lot of rumors. This was the ending. This was the ending written by Xing Tian, the ending defined by the world for them. Xianyuan Wuxiang reached out and touched the bed, and took out a crumpled box of Zhonghua cigarettes. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, took a deep breath, and slowly narrowed his eyes. Jiang Shangyu, Your Highness, Xing Tian hesitated for a moment and said softly, Princess Royal reminded us that Jiang Shangyu is not someone we can deal with. To be exact, if we take action, we may alarm something on him. Maybe, it already knows of our existence. Why do we need to take action to deal with Jiang Shangyu? Can't our big brother manipulate him? Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled. Besides, even if our big brother doesn't take action, Lin Shi came here with a mission. He needs to give us an explanation, so he will take action sooner or later. After taking a deep breath, he picked up his cell phone and began to make a call. While waiting for the number to be dialed, Xianyuan Wuxiang laughed comfortably and happily. Phoenix Pavilion, Gu Xingyun, Kunlun City, Jiang Shangyu. I'm afraid we have gained a lot this time. Unfortunately, there is only one chance. Maybe after this, Jiang Shangyu will notice our existence, and he may have more scruples in the future. Xing Tian shook his head. Maybe he will have more scruples, but it is more likely that he will pay a higher price to kill your majesty. The combination of the calligrapher and the saint might not be as strong as the saint and the apostle around Lin Shi, but in the current real environment, Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian were the most powerful combination under all kinds of restrictions. It was a combination that could make Li Tianlan invincible under all kinds of circumstances. Xianyuan Wuxiang held the phone, and there was no expression on his chubby face. He said blandly, he has no chance. I can feel the change in my big brother. Maybe it won't be long before he can have the characteristic of level 8 authority. Then, who can kill him? Chapter 1102. Li Kuangtu quietly looked at the village in front of him. The village surrounded by the virgin forest maintained the most ancient style to the greatest extent. It was undeveloped and deviated from all shipping routes. For many years, it was so inaccessible that the village did not even have its own name. The village was not big. To be exact, there were 201 households and 463 people. In this village, more than 200 families had always lived on the land of Jianghu State. But there was no doubt that they were outside the map of Jianghu State. In a sense, they were outside the law of Jianghu State. Hidden, remote, and mysterious. This was indeed the most suitable location for a secret base. But backwardness and poverty also made it difficult for the owner of this base to train the most modern soldiers. Li Guangtu looked at everything in front of him indifferently. This was the biggest trump card that Jiang Shangyu wanted to show him. He saw what he wanted. He was a little tempted, but also a little regretful. Crack, in the distance, in front of an ordinary wooden door, a little girl who looked to be only 8 or 9 years old, wearing a dirty cotton dress, sat on the steps in front of the door. She used her tender little hands to tear apart a steel plate that was nearly 10 centimeters thick. The little black cat that was squatting on her shoulder meowed and jumped down from her shoulder, hiding behind her. The little girl was expressionless and seemed to be thinking about how to turn the steel plate into a shape that she was satisfied with. Even with Li Guangtu's train of thought, he could not see what the little girl was trying to do. He could only barely see that she seemed to want to make a weapon, but as she continued to toss, the steel plate quickly became fragmented, and the remaining fragments turned into countless strange and twisted shapes. The girl did not feel annoyed. She just looked at the countless twisted steel plates in front of her in a daze. Li Guangtu marveled at the strength of the other party and also regretted the other party's thinking. The other party seemed to have no thoughts, not even the most basic understanding of the shape of a weapon. That was why the high-strength alloy steel plate was tossed around by her, but she did not realize what went wrong at all. The strength of the other party combined with her age was also incredible in Li Guangtu's eyes. He had personally tested the hardness of the alloy. With his strength, it was a piece of cake for him to tear the alloy. But the little girl could also disassemble the steel plate into strange shapes with her bare hands, which showed that at least in terms of strength, the little girl was no longer at the peak of the fire-flaming realm or even some thunder-shocking realm experts. What did it mean for an 8 or 9-year-old girl to have such power? Some things could not be explained by the word genius. The little girl's existence was not an exception. Every villager here seemed to have extraordinary physical qualities that exceeded the understanding of normal people. More than 400 people. Li Guangtu carefully observed and finally came to a conclusion that even he himself couldn't believe. Among the more than 400 villagers, men and women, old and young, their strength indexes were almost all at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm on average. Among the more than 400 people, there were many little girls who were less than 10 years old, and there were also old people who were over 70 years old. Their strength would be slightly weaker. As for those young people and strong men and women, the top level of strength among them had even reached the invincible realm, and the strength of the half-step invincible realm was everywhere. What did this mean? The Border Control Corps of Jianghu State was known as the strongest and most elite corps in the world. The 20,000 soldiers of the Thunderbolt Battalion in the Border Control Corps were the most elite troops of the Border Control Corps. There were many reasons for the Thunderbolt Battalion's current status. They had the most domineering commander-in-chief, the most rigorous training, the most tenacious fighting will, and the absolute belief in victory. Among so many factors, the strength of the Thunderbolt Battalion was naturally the most important. The average strength of the 20,000 soldiers of the Thunderbolt Battalion was at the ice-condensing realm. They had surpassed the chi-controlling realm of the 4 realms of martial arts. Among the corps of tens of thousands of people, the Thunderbolt Battalion was the only large-scale army in the world whose average strength had reached the ice-condensing realm. Therefore, they could defeat any enemy on any battlefield. They were invincible and invincible. 20,000 elite soldiers who were familiar with all kinds of combat methods, could skillfully use any weapon, and kept their physical functions at the peak. Even the top experts at the peak of the invincible realm did not dare to fight them head-on. And if the scale was further reduced, the Heaven Punishment Troop of the Wang family of Beihai was the peak of the small-scale super-elite troop. There were 300 people in the Heaven Punishment Troop. Their average strength was at the peak of the fire-flaming realm, and even close to the half-step Thunderbolt realm. Such a troop was also a myth in the dark world. Jianghu state could also come up with this kind of lineup, but it would not do so. Any expert close to the thunder-shocking realm was a very important backbone in their respective troops. Except for the Wang family of Beihai, no one would be so extravagant as to form a super-elite troop with the backbone of these middle-level and high-level officers. Therefore, the Heaven Punishment Troop had existed for hundreds of years, but for hundreds of years, no super troop could really be as famous as the Heaven Punishment Troop. The closest to the overall strength of the All Heavens Troop was the Lin clan's Xianyuan sword, and the Li family's life-prolonging palace, Deathless Palace, and Sunluo Palace after Nirvana turned into the Purgatory of Heaven capital. But they were just close. And now, what Li Guangtu saw was a super-elite troop whose strength was a whole realm higher than that of the Heaven Punishment Troop, which was also a myth, and more than 100 people more than the Heaven Punishment Troop. More than 400 people. Their average strength was at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Even Li Guangtu felt his scalp tingle when he thought of this. More than 400 experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm and even close to the half-step invincible realm, if they had enough experience, tacit cooperation, perfect performance, and formed a perfect enough formation, Li Guangtu didn't know who could withstand their full outbreak. At least he could be sure that he couldn't. When the power of more than 400 experts close to the half-step invincible realm broke out as a whole, that kind of power was completely destructive. This kind of troop had never appeared in the wildest imagination of the boldest people. Because everyone knew it was impossible. The peak of the fire-flaming realm was already a middle-level and high-level officer in the army of the world's #1 hegemon country, Jianghu state, and was the backbone of the army lineup. What did the peak of the thunder-shocking realm and the half-step invincible realm mean? This was the power of the general level. The experts who could go to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm would not be unknown in Jianghu state. With such strength, as long as they were not stupid or there were no special reasons, they would at least be major generals, and most of them would be lieutenant generals. Put more than 400 generals together to form a troop. Let's put that aside first. Did Jianghu state have the strength to come up with such a lineup? Even if they could, who would do it? The strength of such a troop was indeed extremely powerful, but once it was hit hard, the consequences would be disastrous. So the idea of forming a dream troop with the average strength of the peak of the thunder-shocking realm had never even appeared, and no one thought about it. But now, in this backward and remote village with almost no modern facilities, Li Guangtu saw such a troop. A troop with the strength close to the half-step invincible realm. Apart from the surprise, Li Guangtu's mind was completely filled with a feeling of disbelief. Of course, the so-called average strength here referred to the average strength. The average strength of the villagers did reach the level close to the half-step invincible realm. But in fact, Li Guangtu could also see that they had almost no fighting consciousness, no fighting intuition, and no contact with martial arts. In this case, their physical functions and strength were strong enough, but if they were all pulled out to fight against the opponent, not to mention the 20,000 Thunderbolt Battalion, even the 300 Heaven Punishment Troop could kill these villagers several times in minutes. But Li Guangtu was not disappointed at all. Fighting consciousness, fighting experience, and the level of martial arts, these things could be filled in without much effort. As for the most difficult level to reach, these villagers had all reached the standard. This also meant that the more than 400 villagers in front of him were like more than 400 pieces of white paper whose strength had reached the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, and they could draw at will into all kinds of shapes. A piece of white paper was good for drawing. Li Guangtu took a deep breath. As his figure flashed, his body appeared beside Jiang Shangyu. Jiang Shangyu lay on a dry grassland, bathed in the pale, almost cold sunlight, with a licorice in his mouth, looking at the sun and the sky in a very leisurely manner. Li Guangtu looked at him and was silent for a long time. Then he said seriously word by word, "Amazing. I'm flattered." Jiang Shangyu smiled lazily and said, "The strength of these people has indeed reached a certain level, but it's not very useful for the time being. But the future is already worth looking forward to." Li Guangtu said with some emotion. "So I said, the future is mine." Jiang Shangyu laughed. Li Guangtu was silent again. After a full 2 or 3 minutes, he suddenly asked, if these people have a certain degree of combat effectiveness and enough tacit understanding, do you think they can pose a fatal threat to Li Tianlan now? It's hard to say. Jiang Shangyu was also silent for a moment, and then he shook his head. But it doesn't matter. The trump card in my hand is indeed worth looking forward to, but now is far from the time for them to be exposed. Their strength can be further enhanced. When they really reach their limit, they can definitely pose a fatal threat to Li Tianlan. As for now, I'm not very clear. Li Guangtu's body shook slightly. His mind was full of Jiang Shangyu's words. Their strength can be further enhanced. Further, his voice suddenly trembled a little. Further enhancement, to what extent? To the invincible realm. Jiang Shangyu said blandly, of course, it will take a long time, but it will come eventually. At that time, maybe the so-called invincible realm will really be like grass. Chapter 1103. Pictures that he had never imagined before appeared in Li Guangtu's mind. Perhaps he and Jiang Shangyu would never know that in the era of Beihai and the purgatory of Heaven Capital, when there were metaphysical masters in Zhongzhou State, Xian Xuanzi and Great Master Wu Wei had long predicted that the invincible realm was as weak as grass. When the Chosen One appeared, the tribulation came. The Chosen One should face the tribulation, and who should face the Chosen One? Xian Xuanzi's words still had traces of existence. But with the death of Great Master Wu Wei and the disappearance of Xian Xuanzi, these traces were fading in everyone's hearts day by day. Until Jiang Shangyu's voice rang in Li Guangtu's ears. The light voice was as deafening as thunder. A whole village with an average strength of the invincible realm. More than 400 people. In the entire dark world, there probably wouldn't be so many invincible realm experts in the world for hundreds of years. Li Guangtu looked at Jiang Shangyu seriously. There was deep fear in his eyes. There was also a touch of undisguised fear. He didn't want to admit it, but he had to. If what Jiang Shangyu said was true, when more than 400 invincible realm experts charged at the same time, what was Li Tianlan? At best, he could only be regarded as a nonentity. And he himself was even less than an ant. If this thing became true, where would he find his place in the future? Things were not as bad as he thought. Of course, they were not as good as he thought. Jiang Shangyu interrupted Li Guangtu's thoughts and said with a smile, the world has changed. What do you mean? Li Guangtu frowned. Jiang Shangyu smiled without saying a word. He just looked at the villagers coming and going in the village not far away. This was obviously not their normal state, so their movements always seemed a little stiff and uncoordinated. Li Guangtu couldn't see anything because he didn't know this place. But these flaws were very clear in Jiang Shangyu's eyes. He hid something from Li Guangtu. For example, the camp behind him and the true face of the village. Li Guangtu was completely different from Gu Xingyan. Gu Xingyan, who seemed to be awe-inspiring, had almost lost all his spirit. For the survival of himself and his tribe, Gu Xingyan could give up anything. The vast division of camps might have been different in his thinking, which was limited by the region. Therefore, Jiang Shangyu could make Gu Xingyan one of his people. However, Li Guangtu was still proud. Even if his current strength had been surpassed by Li Tianlan, the pride in his heart did not disappear much. The Li family's stubbornness doomed him to be the second Gu Xingyan. In order to survive, Gu Xingyan could not give up anything. People like Li Guangtu were willing to sacrifice anything in order to survive. Gu Xingyan could give up his dignity, status, and reputation. But when it was necessary, Li Guangtu was willing to sacrifice his life at all costs. There were too many things worth discussing about Li Guangtu's character, but every invincible realm expert who came out of the Li family did not lack the strength of character that would rather break than bend. Perhaps when things really reached the point of no return, Li Guangtu would refuse everyone's alliance, even disband the purgatory of Heaven Capital, and challenge Li Tianlan alone. This seemed to be an unreasonable act of courting death. But Li Guangtu was such a person. Such a person lived not to keep anything, but to pursue something. The chaotic behavior of the dark shadow world was regarded by many people as evil and degeneration. In fact, it was just the purest chaos, but it was indeed the darkness more evil than degeneration. Li Kuangtu might not accept the gift from the dark shadow world. More importantly, as Dongqing Rushi's biological father, the dark shadow world did not dare to pollute before it was fully sure. Pollute him. However, Jiang Shanyu finally told some truth to Li Kuangtu. The world was indeed changing. The initial change began when Li Tianlan triggered the sword energy left by the god of war to deal with the sneak attack of him and Li Kuangtu. The miracle city in the real environment had some interaction with the starry sky. At that moment, both the Order Camp and the Dark Shadow Camp could roughly detect the vague location of the miracle city and Li Tianlan's aura. When the two environments, illusion and reality, merged to a certain extent, the world was also changing unconsciously. The most obvious change was that it was easier to break through in strength than before. More than 400 people in the village could reach the strength of the invincible realm. And as time went on, there would be more and more invincible realm experts in the dark world. Invincible realm experts were like grass. What was coming was a chaotic world, a prosperous world, and also the end of the world. Jiang Shanyu quietly observed the villagers in the village. How to use this force to completely kill Li Tianlan before his official return was the primary problem he needed to consider now. With Li Tianlan's current strength, it was obviously impossible to kill Li Tianlan with the village in front of him. He had to turn these villagers into elite soldiers, in line with the standards of the Dark Shadow world as soon as possible. They were elite soldiers, not elites. The most basic condition for the so-called elite soldiers was to be able to survive in the void environment and have a certain degree of destructive power on the battlefield, where the victory in the starry sky was the prerequisite. That was the real invincible realm. They could survive temporarily by using their own domain and sword energy to form a domain that could isolate the void. This was the goal that Jiang Shanyu had to achieve now. The strength of these people is still too weak. Jiang Shanyu suddenly said. They're like pieces of blank paper. Although they're very strong, they don't have the slightest bit of awareness and experience. Their tacit understanding is also close to zero. In their current state, an army of 5,000 people can easily wipe out an entire village. They don't even need to be elites at the ace level. Just a first-line army with sufficient equipment can easily wipe out an entire village. Li Kuangtu commented bluntly. Fortunately, this is temporary. Jiang Shanyu said with a smile, in the near future, I will find a way to instill something into them, such as combat experience, combat tacit understanding, and so on. At least it can lay some foundation for them. Instill? Li Kuangtu raised his eyebrows in surprise. After living for so long, it was the first time that he had heard that this thing could be instilled. It probably needs a processor to download something, and then the data transmission. My metaphor is a little inappropriate, but that's the general idea. Jiang Shanyu explained very seriously. Processor, Li Kuangtu muttered to himself. Ha! Isn't that a ready-made processor? His download should be almost done. Jiang Shanyu casually pointed in a certain direction. Li Kuangtu's pupils contracted slightly. Of course, he knew who was there. But before he could say anything, the village in front of him suddenly changed. Sunlight, streets, houses, people, space, everything seemed to distort in an instant without warning. Boom! In the huge roar, in the corner of the village, in the direction that Jiang Shanyu pointed, a clear wave of air that was visible to the naked eye suddenly exploded. The wave of air twisted and changed, and it looked as if the space of the whole village was constantly boiling. An aura that had been suppressed for a long time was rising unscrupulously in the wave of air, as if it would never have a limit. That was the aura close to the peak of the invincible realm. As soon as Li Kuangtu came to this conclusion, the rising aura, it had directly crossed the threshold of the peak of the invincible realm. It was easy, natural, and without any reluctance. The peak of the invincible realm seemed to be just a starting point. The strong aura kept rising, rising again and again, madly rushing in the domain of the peak of the invincible realm. 1 minute, or 1 hour. In his perception, the aura steadily stayed at the level of only half a step or even a small half step away from breaking through to the peak of the invincible realm. The domain, which was so strong that it seemed to be a substance, distorted everything that could be seen with the naked eye. It was constantly shrinking and expanding. The corner of Li Guangtu's mouth twitched slightly. That was the aura of Gu Xingyun. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed that Gu Xingyun could make such a major breakthrough in just a few days. From close to the peak of the invincible realm, he climbed all the way to the peak of the invincible realm. Half a year, 1 year, 2 years, maybe tomorrow, Gu Xingyun might break through again and stand at the same height as him. Gu Xingyun, was this the processor that Jiang Xiangyu mentioned? That was the fact. Gu Xingyun, who had successfully broken through, did not have time to be ecstatic. He didn't even have time to feel the changes in his body. At the moment of the breakthrough, he opened his eyes. In the deepest level of meditation, his surroundings had already become a void of nothingness. But the moment he opened his eyes, pieces of blood-red shimmer lit up in the void. In front of him, thousands of eyes appeared without any warning. Those pairs of eyes squeezed together and stared straight at Gu Xingyun. Every pair of eyes seemed to be speaking, conveying some kind of information to him. His brain was passively accepting everything and operating at a crazy speed. Hence, his aura continued to rise, and all kinds of battle scenes kept appearing in his mind. Countless eyes continued to instill some information into him. His brain seemed to have become a hard disk, and the storage space had reached its limit. Hence, endless information was spilled out. In the end, everyone in the village stopped. More than 400 villagers seemed to have become a whole brain. Everyone began to accept all kinds of chaotic but extremely clear information. Jiang Xiangyu and Li Guangtu were both watching this scene. The former's eyes were deep, but the latter's eyes were only blank. Gu Xingyun's strength is very good now, Jiang Xiangyu suddenly said. Li Guangtu gritted his teeth and snorted, saying nothing. He could feel that Gu Xingyun's strength was still at the peak of the invincible realm, but the other party had a vague sense of danger that made him feel uncomfortable. In a sense, the current Gu Xingyun seemed to have become an example similar to Li Tianlan, whose strength exceeded his realm. The only difference was that Li Tianlan's strength exceeded his realm by too much. I want to try again, Jiang Xiangyu said in a low voice. What? Li Guangtu frowned. Kill Li Tianlan. Jiang Xiangyu looked at Li Guangtu with a smile. With the three of us and some villagers at most, do you think it's feasible? Before Li Guangtu could speak, Jiang Xiangyu continued, I've already given out the bait to test him. What kind of bait? What do you want to test? Li Guangtu asked with a frown. Two very suspicious people have appeared around Li Tianlan recently. I want to test their origins. Do you think it's easy? Li Guangtu shook his head disapprovingly. It's not difficult. There are always some things that they can't hide, such as some words that are taboo to them. Jiang Xiangyu sneered. Chapter 1104. When the car entered the manor of the Bai family, Li Tianlan felt something and suddenly parked the car on the clean and tidy road of the manor. He got out of the car and quietly looked at the sky in the southeast direction, thinking about something. Qin Weibai, who had been a little absent-minded for a few days and seemed to be thinking about something all the time, reacted after a while. She opened the door and walked to Li Tianlan, saying softly, What's wrong? There is something strange there. Li Tianlan's voice was hesitant and uncertain, but the doubt in his eyes gradually began to become clear. It could not be said whether it was his own intuition or heartless will. In the sky extremely far away in the southeast direction, he could clearly feel a power that was of the same origin as heartless twisting and struggling, as if it was imprisoned. Li Tianlan could feel Wuqing's desire, and he could also feel the longing of that mass of energy for Wuqing in the distant southeast. When he perceived this, Li Tianlan suddenly understood something. That mass of energy seemed to have been imprisoned for several days. It was constantly struggling, but it could not return to him and Wuqing. The sharpness in Li Tianlan's eyes flashed away. He did not know what could fix the energy belonging to a murderous weapon in a certain area for several days, but this feeling appeared so coincidentally that he instinctively felt that this phenomenon contained some artificial factors. Li Tianlan raised his palm slightly, and his eyes were cold. Qin Weibai looked at him in astonishment. Li Tianlan also looked at his raised palm in astonishment. He did not know what his instinct wanted to do. The energy that belonged to Ruthless suddenly became clear. Li Tianlan was sure that it was in the southeast direction. But after the sense of distance was magnified, it became extremely blurred. Vaguely, it was at least hundreds of kilometers away. If Ruthless was in his peak state, the distance of hundreds of kilometers could be said to be almost instantaneous. But now Ruthless' energy was exhausted, and his consciousness was blurred. And Li Tianlan himself, in a normal state, absolutely could not attack a target hundreds of kilometers away without knowing what it was. But at that moment, Li Tianlan's instinct told him that he could do it. He did not know why. But he felt that he could do it. The moment he raised his palm, it was as if he was holding a key. It was as if there was a door in front of him. As long as he used the key to open the door, his attack could be instantly transmitted hundreds of kilometers away. It could even be transmitted to any place in the world. The feeling was so clear that Li Tianlan was a little stunned. This slight astonishment caused his rationality to start thinking at the same time. And so the instinct disappeared. The key had also disappeared. In his perception, the energy that belonged to Heartless also became blurry. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes, which were shining. The breakthrough into the invincible realm this time brought him more confusion than the power it brought him. That feeling of being able to accomplish something in a certain way appeared from time to time, turning into rays of dazzling light. They were like shooting stars in his mind, fleeting and uncontrollable. Li Tianlan roughly knew what he could do, but he had no idea how to do it. There seemed to be a thicker and thicker obstacle in front of him, causing him to have more and more doubts. Li Tianlan slowly lowered his palm with no expression on his face. Heartless, who was draped over his body, suddenly began to fly. Almost at the same time, the energy that belonged to Heartless in his perception became clear again. Something that imprisoned Heartless seemed to be aware of Li Tianlan's and Heartless' attention, and that feeling disappeared almost instantly. The next second, the transparent energy streaked across the sky at an unimaginable absolute speed, like a shooting star, heading straight for Yuzhou. Li Tianlan's gaze at the sky only slightly condensed for a moment. A colorful stream of light had already appeared at the end of his line of sight. Excitement, satisfaction, expectation, and a clear will made the energy not hide its whereabouts at all. A rainbow tens of thousands of meters long appeared over Yuzhou. The rainbow continued to spread, and the seemingly small but actually infinite energy hit the black windbreaker on Li Tianlan in the blink of an eye. The windbreaker, which was constantly flying, seemed to be completely quiet for a moment. Li Tianlan stood where he was for a long time without moving. At this moment, he seemed to be temporarily isolated from the world and fell into an almost eternal meditation. At the same time, over the Bohai Strait of Zhongzhou State, Lin Shi and Wang Xingxiao were shrouded in the virtual light curtain made by the apostle. Looking at the direction where heartless energy disappeared, they were silent. The apostle was undoubtedly a little excited. He wanted to say something several times but stopped himself. Finally, he couldn't help but say, "Your Highness, don't think too much." Lin Shi shook his head. "It's meaningless. With Her Highness's ability, even if it's just a wisp of consciousness, it's not something we can resist now. She said she would watch us, so we can't do what she doesn't want us to do." The double pupils in his eyes were constantly condensing and dispersing. As the pupils opened and closed, there seemed to be countless suns, moons, and stars rising and falling. He recalled some conclusions he had just come to when he came into contact with the energy and finally shook his head. In the battle that year, King Wei's injury was too serious. Now is not the time to fuse. "King Wei?" Wang Xingxiao asked, feeling a little strange. From Africa continent to Bohai Sea, when the virtual data spread out, Wang Xingxiao could hardly feel the passage of time, and Wang Xingxiao didn't know what they were going to do here after crossing more than half of the world. In fact, from beginning to end, Wang Xingxiao didn't even see the energy that belonged to Heartless. Lin Shi glanced at Wang Xingxiao and said with a faint smile, "The Qingwei I'm talking about is the life metal you've been studying for many years." At the end of his words, his tone was a little strange. After a few seconds of silence, he finally laughed mockingly. "Oh, metal, Qingwei, metal, Heartless. Wuyo." Wang Xingxiao's heart suddenly tightened. Any topic about Wuyo could arouse his strong vigilance and defense now. He looked at Lin Shi calmly and said slowly, "Isn't that metal?" "You can say that." Lin Shi said faintly, "But in our understanding, the metal you know should be a piece of stone." Stone? Wang Xingxiao's eyes were a little strange. The Wang family of Beihai had never given up on the study of the life metal. After all, since they knew that it was a meteorite from outer space, a meteorite with its own consciousness and life, in the eyes of many people, this piece of metal was equivalent to the first officially confirmed extraterrestrial life. It might not be accurate to say that it was an alien, but it was extremely accurate to say that it was an extraterrestrial life. However, Wang Xingxiao was not surprised by this statement. The so-called life metal was originally a meteorite from outer space, and it could also be regarded as a stone. However, the Wang family of Beihai had studied it many times and never found that it had any characteristics that belonged to a stone. Lin Shi's eyes were in a trance for a moment. The deeds of King Wei in the space-time corridor had countless legends in the War God realm, the Emperor Palace, and even in the current Miracle City. It could be said that he was a household name. The legend of Miracle City had been revised a lot, and some things had even been beautified. But the records of King Wei outside Miracle City were all true. In Lin Shi's understanding of King Wei, his life was roughly divided into 3 stages. As the first alien lord of the human clan, King Wei's most glorious period was naturally the period when he fought side by side with the First Majesty. At the very beginning, King Wei was his weapon. That history was too ancient. Even the corridor of time and space had lost a lot of information in the many terminations and reincarnations. Even the emperor of the corridor of time and space had forgotten most of it. All that was left were bits and pieces about King Wei. In this first most glorious period that belonged to King Wei, there was the clearest record about him that no one could forget. In King Wei, the authority that belonged to the human clan was born. This was the most authentic record and the biggest legend. And the second stage of King Wei was the stage where he was assimilated by the Order Camp. This soul-stirring legend had even spread throughout Miracle City, and it had been translated into many versions and circulated in various countries. The origin of this legend came from Jianghu State. Various adaptations, remakes, and biographies were everywhere. It was a household name. Even children as young as 3 or 5 years old knew about this legend about King Wei. But no one knew that the protagonist of this legend was King Wei, who was assimilated by the Order Camp in the second stage. People only remembered him by another name. The name that brought him the greatest humiliation. The name that he had after he was assimilated by the Order Camp. It was also because the legend of King Wei had been spread on Earth to this day that everyone knew about it. That was why King Wei was in a weak stage where he was seriously injured but not dead. There were more than 1 billion people in Jianghu State. Maybe some people didn't know who the president was, but no one dared to say that they hadn't heard of King Wei's other name. This was also the most crucial reason for King Wei to form a real imprint. And in the middle of the second stage to the third stage. At that time, the majesty of the space-time corridor had not yet reached the peak. Under the circumstances that the first human emperor had fallen, King Wei brazenly returned to the neutral prestige from the Order Camp. He was almost the pillar of the entire human clan at that time. How to let King Wei return to the peak, let him and Li Tianlan return to the most glorious times, and let those blurred legends return to the past was something that everyone was thinking about. To some extent, it could even be said to be their responsibility. Lin Shi glanced at Wang Tianzong. Looking at his calm but extremely vigilant eyes, he suddenly laughed. Maybe you have guessed something, but it doesn't matter. I just want to tell you that the integration of Wuyo of Beihai, Wuyo of the Lin clan, and Wuyo of His Majesty Li Tianlan is the general trend. You can't stop it. No one can stop it. But it will take a long time. I think you don't have to tell me what your attitude is. When His Highness the Sword Emperor recovers and returns, we will communicate with him about this alone. Chapter 1105. The call was not connected. After a long wait, the other end of the phone indicated that the other party was not in the service area. It was absolutely rare to encounter the other party not in the service area in the capital of Jianghu State. Xianyuan Wushang was a little surprised and dialed Li Tianlan's cell phone again. It was still the other party not in the service area. The other side of the room was empty in his perception. Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were not there. The young couple would not run to the deserted countryside at this time. Xianyuan Wushang thought about it and put down the phone. Xing Tian was still thinking about something. The writing brush appeared in his hand again. Thinking about all the possible variables, Xing Tian raised the brush again and wrote in the air. Considering Mao Song's position, his recent activities will not leave the mansion of the Qin family, and it is impossible for him to hide. But in view of his psychological quality and Qin Shi's years of training, Qin Shi's death will undoubtedly torture his spirit. He will feel guilty, uneasy, and regret. He will also have a distorted sense of expectation for the future. If his mental state is extremely unstable, then in the next very short time, he will inevitably reveal some flaws, and then some clues will be found. Mao Song's situation will soon be noticed, and he will be, the tip of the brush paused. Instead of writing a specific name, Xing Tian wrote, he will be controlled by the people of Emperor Dong's palace. Suffering from mental torture, he will not be able to bear too much pressure, and will confess what he did as soon as possible. The parliament will believe Mao Song's testimony because there is no flaw in the logic, and this is the truth. There is an undeniable fact. There is no love between Lin Yin and Qin Weibai. For Qin Weibai, there is only fear. Lin Yin only had fear, but after countless careful schemes, as a relatively weak woman, the possibility of Lin Yin falling in love with Mao Song was very high. Out of longing, uneasiness, and other psychological reasons, after Qin Shi's death, Lin Yin, who roughly understands the situation and considers herself an outsider, will appear in Yuzhou and appear beside Mao Song. The tip of the brush paused and continued, the absolute strength of Emperor Dong's palace will destroy Lin Yin, right? Her fear, desperate situation, and Mao Song's situation will make her return to the psychological state of a normal woman, plus some special reasons. Phoenix Pavilion, Gu Xingyun, Qin Weibai, will appear in front of the parliament. The parliament will, Kacha, the incorporeal brush let out a crisp cracking sound, and faintly discernible cracks began to appear. Xing Tian's face changed slightly. Once again, he condensed a writing brush in the air, erased the word definitely, and continued to write. The parliament will probably be attracted by Mao Song and Lin Yin, and then turn its attention to Kunlun City and Huang. This will cause some unknown change in the council's mentality. The brush stopped. Then, it disappeared completely. Xianyuan Wushang, who was watching with great interest, paused and then asked, "What changes?" "Unknown changes," Xing Tian said after a moment of silence. Xianyuan Wushang tilted his head and looked expressionlessly at Xing Tian. "That's it? You've been writing for half a day, and what's the ending? Are you a eunuch?" "I can't write it." Xing Tian's tone was calm. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Not bad." In the real environment of Miracle City, it involved Li Tianlan, Jiang Shangyu, and the parliament of Jianghu State. It was normal that Xing Tian couldn't write it. In fact, everything he did today was vaguely beyond his authority. After learning about Phoenix Pavilion and Jiang Shangyu, the mentality of the parliament would definitely change. However, such a change, because it hadn't happened yet, so they had no way to know. But thinking about it carefully, such a change should not be a bad thing after all. Now that the framework of the matter had been written by Xing Tian, it was only to see how things would develop in the end. No matter how it developed next, it would be much better than before. It's getting more and more lively. Xianyuan Wuxiang sighed softly. I've seen similar situations in the early days of the space-time corridor. Now, no one has the mood to do so. When there is no external threat that cannot be resisted, the so-called struggle, no matter how cruel, seems very childish. Xing Tian was silent and did not speak. Xianyuan Wuxiang stretched himself and stood up. He glanced at Xing Tian. What do you want to eat? Anything is fine. Xing Tian's voice was simple and honest. In Xianyuan Wuxiang's sight, Xing Tian's huge and thick legs had almost turned into nothingness. Under the shining light, only the faint, almost transparent shadows of his legs could be seen. Obviously, Xing Tian was not suitable to go out in this state. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded. After thinking for a while, he took out a large bucket of purified water from somewhere. Eat this. Xianyuan Wuxiang handed the purified water to Xing Tian. Xing Tian's face changed slightly, and then he became a little excited. His huge hand that took the purified water trembled slightly. Thank you, Your Highness. Xianyuan Wuxiang waved his hand and turned to leave the room. The cafeteria of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel was crowded in the evening. Xianyuan Wuxiang picked some food in the cafeteria and found a corner to eat slowly. This prince of the space-time corridor wasn't harmless at all when he ate. Especially when he was alone, his entire person looked exceptionally serious. Can I sit here? A gentle voice with a hint of a smile suddenly rang out. The man, who looked to be in his 40s or 50s, smiled at Xianyuan Wuxiang. He seemed to be a middle-aged executive of a company who came to Yuzhou for a business trip. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, a white shirt, a dark tie, a watch, trousers, leather shoes, and immaculate hair. He smiled politely and looked elegant. Whatever. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded and ate the food in front of him without looking up. The middle-aged man didn't seem to think that the fat man in front of him was rude. He sat quietly in front of Xianyuan Wuxiang. He crossed his fingers, sat upright, and looked at Xianyuan Wuxiang with a smile, without taking anything from him. Do you know me? Xianyuan Wuxiang asked casually and licked the oil stains on his fingers. No, I don't. The middle-aged man smiled and shook his head. But I really want to know you. The entire Yuzhou knew that His Majesty Li Tianlan suddenly had two mysterious figures around him, who could be taken into the Bai family and go to the Qin family together. Based on this alone, it could be seen that His Majesty Li Tianlan trusted Your Excellency. Believe me, there are many people in Yuzhou who don't know you, but there are many who want to know you. There are 547 people in the cafeteria right now. About 1/3 of them have observed me without batting an eyelid. Are they the people who want to get to know me? But they live here and come here to eat, but more than that, they want to know my brother and sister-in-law, right? Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled carelessly. Maybe. But in my opinion, you are also worth making friends with. He stretched out his hand to Xianyuan Wuxiang and said with a smile, Zhao Qiming, what's your name? You are more direct than them. Xianyuan Wuxiang said lightly, but I don't like to be direct. From your attitude, I can feel that you are alert and testing me. He raised his greasy hand and wiped it on the middle-aged man's sleeve, wiping his saliva and oil stains on it. He fully expressed his dissatisfaction. My name is Xianyuan Wuxiang. Tell me what you want. Zhao Qiming's expression was a little stiff. He didn't know whether it was because of the content of Xianyuan Wuxiang's words or his actions, or both. He took a deep look at Xianyuan Wuxiang, slowly sat down, and pondered. He was undoubtedly a very steady person. Even though Xianyuan Wuxiang's attitude was somewhat unexpected, he was just a little more cautious. Other than that, he didn't show anything else. Xianyuan Wuxiang's eyes were a little playful. How do you think the current Wang family of Beihai compares to Emperor Dong's palace? The middle-aged man asked softly after a moment of silence. You work for Wang Xingxiao? Direct, simple, sharp, and even a little rude. Xianyuan Wushang asked directly. A lot of words that Zhao Qiming had prepared suddenly got stuck in his throat. He felt a little uncomfortable. After 2 seconds, he said in a low voice, I am indeed serving the Wang family of Beihai. What does he want you to do? Xianyuan Wushang's tone was very calm, but it was extremely rude to control the conversation. The corner of Zhao Qiming's mouth twitched uncontrollably. This was completely different from the conversation he had imagined. There was no probing, no roundabout, no temptation, nothing at all. In a few words, the other party directly talked about the topic to the point where there was no room for discussion. He could already imagine what would happen next. He made an invitation. The other party refused. Then, the conversation was over. In a few words, it was really just a few words. But the conversation shouldn't be like this. Zhao Qiming kept taking deep breaths, and his smile began to become reluctant. Well, if possible, we hope that you can join the Wang family of Beihai. But I can promise that the Wang family of Beihai will give you double the treatment you enjoy in Emperor Dong's palace, and... You work for Wang Xingxiao? Xianyuan Wushang asked again. Zhao Qiming was stunned. He forced himself to calm down and said, yes. You're not. Xianyuan Wushang laughed and said, Wang Xingxiao now has a more important partner. Even if he doesn't know my identity, his partner always knows. No matter how stupid he is, he won't let you invite me to join the Wang family of Beihai. Do you understand what I mean? After a pause, he laughed again and said, I just want a small clinic, or an infirmary, in Emperor Dong's palace. Double it for me? 2 clinics. That's really tempting. Zhao Qiming had no time to think about what Xianyuan Wushang had said before, or he didn't want to think about it. Hearing the second half of Xianyuan Wushang's words, he instinctively said, if you have any other requirements, we can talk about it. The Wang family of Beihai has passed the crisis and will inevitably rule the dark world again in the future. If Emperor Dong's palace only gives you a small clinic, what's the point of staying in such a Emperor Dong's palace? The Wang family of Beihai is very sincere. Why do you stay with Dong Huang and help the wicked do evil? Help the wicked do evil. When Zhao Qiming said this word, he deliberately emphasized it, and there was a flash of nervousness in his eyes. He really didn't work for Wang Xingxiao. But the problem was that he didn't know who worked for him on Earth. He just received the commission to contact Xianyuan Wushang. And the condition of the commissioning party was very simple. They asked him to invite Xianyuan Wushang to join the Wang family of Beihai. The only strange thing was the word, help the wicked do evil. This was the word that the commissioning party explicitly asked him to say in front of Xianyuan Wushang. Zhao Qiming stared at Xianyuan Wushang's reaction. There was no sudden change of expression, no anger, no sneer. Xianyuan Wushang, who had been smiling faintly, suddenly stopped smiling. He slowly raised his head and looked at Zhao Qiming. His chubby, harmless face was devoid of any expression. This Xianyuan Wushang was strange and dignified. He looked at Zhao Qiming with indifference, as if he was looking at a dead man. Zhao Qiming was almost instantly soaked in cold sweat. His body stiffened and he stared at Xianyuan Wushang's face. Do you know? Xianyuan Wushang wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin and said unhurriedly, based on what you said, everyone in my hometown can kill you. Not just you, but your family, your relatives, your friends, your relatives' friends, your friends' friends. Everyone who has even the slightest relationship with you will receive a punishment worse than death. An indescribable chill spread from the soles of his feet to his brain in an instant. Zhao Qiming's breathing suddenly became rapid. You work for Jiang Shangyu. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly laughed. If you work for Wang Xingxiao, he wouldn't dare to let you bring these words to me. Lin Shi wouldn't allow it. Even he doesn't dare to say these words, and neither do I, whoever says them will die. The higher the status, the more it is so. Only Jiang Shangyu can be a human being without scruples. Obviously, he has given up everything he can give up. Maybe you're innocent. Xianyuan Wushang threw the napkin on the table. But you're guilty. You're guilty. It was like a supreme judgment, indifferent, lofty, majestic, and irresistible. Zhao Qiming's body suddenly twitched violently. In the void, an extremely strong life force directly poured into Zhao Qiming's body. The strong vitality nourished Zhao Qiming's body at an unimaginable speed. All the dirt in his body evaporated in an instant. All the viruses and bacteria were emptied. The toxins accumulated by years of drinking and smoking were completely gone. Some hidden dangers in his body that he hadn't noticed were also completely gone. Zhao Qiming's face was ruddy, energetic, and radiant. The toxins in every drop of blood in his body were completely dispelled by this vitality. It was an abrupt yet extremely comfortable feeling. That vitality was still spreading in his body, healing all the hidden dangers in his body. It continued to spread, burst, and spread. The vitality stimulated every cell in his body. All the cells and blood began to grow after receiving a huge amount of nutrients. His 5 viscera and 6 bowels were frantically absorbing this wisp of vitality. At this moment, in front of Xianyuan Wushang, Zhao Qiming's body was like an inflated balloon, gradually expanding at a speed visible to the naked eye. Zhao Qiming's eyes became extremely frightened. He wanted to speak, but the muscles in his mouth and throat were growing crazily, drowning his tongue, his teeth, and occupying every part of his mouth. Crack! The infinitely growing muscles completely crushed the bones in his body. The growing muscles blocked more and more blood in his body. He began to suffocate. His heart pressed against his chest. The muscles burst his nose and even grew out of his eyes and ears. The extremely disgusting and frightening scene also meant that he was suffering the most extreme pain. Xianyuan Wushang walked away from him expressionlessly. Zhao Qiming, whose body had expanded, staggered and fell to the ground. He couldn't make any sound, but his body was crazily twitching and trembling. Looking at him for the last time, the expressionless Xianyuan Wushang twitched the corner of his mouth and sneered, "Rebel. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."